Tonight, let's step quietly into the shadows behind the throne, a place where emperors whispered to birds before battle, where queens trembled beneath eclipsed moons, and where the world's most powerful souls lived in the grip of their dreams. You might imagine that sitting on a throne makes you fearless, but what if power only means you have more to lose? What if the difference between triumph and disaster was simply reading the signs correctly? Tonight, we're lifting that golden curtain to reveal something rarely spoken of, the secret superstitions that guided the rulers. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will forever change how you see power. Before we begin, if you're finding comfort in these words, would you consider subscribing? If this story stirs something in you, perhaps leave a like or tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Are you tucked in bed? On a quiet drive? I truly want to know. Your presence here means everything, and it helps me continue bringing you these stories each night. Now, dim the lights. Let the world outside fade away, and let's step back in time together. The weight of the crown. Here's something they rarely teach you. Imagine waking each morning in a palace so vast you could lose yourself in its corridors. Thousands of souls depending on your every word. One misstep, one failed harvest, one lost battle, one angry god, and your entire kingdom could crumble into dust. Your enemies circle like wolves. Assassins hide in every shadow, and you can never show weakness. Not once. Because the moment you do, someone will reach for that crown on your head. Now imagine living like that every single day. This is why rulers throughout history didn't just believe in superstitions. They needed them like air. When you hold such power, you also hold such fear. In a world without weather forecasts, without medicine, without any way to glimpse tomorrow, how do you make decisions that could save or destroy millions? You look for signs. You watch the birds. You study the stars. You listen to your dreams. You seek out prophets, oracles, seers. You build rituals to shield yourself from invisible enemies. At least then you feel some thread of control. At least then, you're not completely alone in the dark. A night before battle. Let me take you to a moment that captures this terror perfectly. The year is 331 BC. Alexander the Great, just 25 years old, never defeated in battle, stands on the edge of his greatest challenge. Tomorrow, he faces the Persian Empire at Gaugamela. This battle will decide the fate of the known world. But the Persians command over 100,000 soldiers, war elephants, chariots with blades spinning from their wheels, designed to cut through men like grass. And they're fighting on their own ground. The night before, Alexander cannot sleep. Neither can his men. Everyone knows that tomorrow, many will not see another sunrise. Then, 12 days before the battle, something happened. The moon disappeared. A total lunar eclipse darkened the sky. For us, an eclipse is simple science. But imagine being an ancient soldier, watching the moon. That constant, reliable light just vanish. Gone. As if the gods had turned away. Panic rippled through Alexander's camp. Whispers spread like wildfire. It's a sign. The gods are angry. We shouldn't fight. And here's what's beautiful. Alexander didn't dismiss their fear. Instead, he called for his personal seer, Aristander of Telmessus, trusted since childhood, part therapist, part prophet, part crisis counselor, all in one. Aristander studied the eclipse with careful eyes. He watched the shadow's movement, noted the time, the direction, the color. Then he made his interpretation. The eclipse, Aristander announced to the gathered army, means the moon, symbol of Persia, is being covered in shadow. In this coming month, the Persian Empire will fall into darkness. Victory belongs to Alexander. The army erupted in cheers. That same omen that had terrified them moments ago became their greatest source of strength. They marched into battle believing the gods had promised them victory. And they won. Spectacularly. Now, here's the question that should haunt us. Did Aristander truly believe his interpretation? Or did he understand that his real job wasn't predicting the future? It was managing the present? Was he mystic or psychologist, knowing that soldiers fight better when they believe fate walks beside them? We'll never know. But we do know this. Alexander never made a major decision without consulting omens. This wasn't performance. He genuinely believed the gods spoke through birds, through dreams, through thunder, splitting the sky. And he wasn't alone. The pattern across time. Throughout history, the pattern echoes again and again. Roman senators wouldn't decide without consulting augurs who read the flight patterns of birds. Chinese emperors watched for celestial signs, comets, eclipses, unusual clouds, believing heaven itself was sending messages. Medieval European kings kept court astrologers closer than family. Egyptian pharaohs consulted priests who claimed to speak with gods. The British monarchy has maintained sacred ravens at the Tower of London for centuries, believing that if the ravens ever left, the kingdom would fall. They still keep those ravens today, 6 of them, with clipped wings, just in case. Even now, in our age of science and reason, why take the chance? But here's what's truly fascinating. It's easy to look back and think, how foolish, how primitive. But let me ask you something. Have you ever knocked on wood? Avoided walking under a ladder? Felt uneasy about the number 13? Worn a lucky shirt to something important? Kept a good luck charm? Of course you have. We all have. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We're not that different from these ancient rulers. The stakes might be lower. Most of us aren't deciding whether to invade Persia, but the psychology is exactly the same. When we face uncertainty, when we feel powerless, when the outcome matters deeply, we look for patterns. We create rituals. We find meaning in coincidence. It's not stupidity. It's human nature. It's how our minds cope with an unpredictable universe. But when you're a ruler, this natural tendency amplifies 1,000-fold. Your decisions affect everyone. Your nightmares become policy. Your paranoia reshapes kingdoms. Your superstitions can start wars or prevent them. When omens turn dark, let me show you the darker side. In medieval Europe, certain omens were believed to predict death. Dead birds falling from the sky, blood-red moons, dreams of teeth falling out, crows gathering near the palace. And kings took these signs seriously, sometimes fatally so. When King Henry VI of England began suffering from mental illness in the 1450s, his advisors noticed strange omens appearing. A meteor shower, an unusual alignment of planets, a white deer seen near the castle. Some courtiers took these as signs that Henry's reign was cursed, that God had withdrawn his favor. And here's where superstition becomes dangerous. These beliefs became self-fulfilling prophecies. Nobles who believed the omens started plotting against Henry, using the signs to justify rebellion, convincing themselves they weren't committing treason. They were following heaven's will. Henry lost his throne, descended into madness, and was eventually murdered in the Tower of London. Think about that for a moment. Did the omens predict his fall? Or did belief in the omens cause it? This is the paradox. Superstitions were supposed to provide certainty in an uncertain world, but instead, they often created the very chaos they were meant to prevent. A ruler who sees omens of disaster becomes paranoid. A paranoid ruler makes defensive choices. Those choices create enemies. Those enemies fulfill the prophecy. It's like convincing yourself you'll fail a test, becoming too anxious to study properly, and then actually failing. The belief creates the reality. The hidden wisdom. But here's the strange twist. Sometimes, just sometimes, superstitions actually worked. Not because they were magical, but because they forced rulers to pause and think. Ancient Roman augury wasn't just about predicting the future. It was about creating a structured decision-making process. Before any major action, declaring war, signing treaties, appointing magistrates, Roman leaders had to take the auspices. They had to watch sacred chickens eat, observe bird flight patterns, consult the augurs. And you know what? This forced pause was often incredibly valuable. It gave hot-headed generals time to cool down. It gave impulsive emperors a reason to sleep on major decisions. It created a cultural norm that said, don't rush. Look for signs. Consider the consequences. Was this divine wisdom? Or just good governance wrapped in religious ritual? Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the superstition worked precisely because people believed in it. There's a Roman story I love. In 249 BC, a general named Publius Claudius Pulcher was about to fight a major naval battle. Custom required him to consult the sacred chickens first. If they ate eagerly, it was a good omen. If they refused, the battle should be postponed. The chickens refused to eat. Publius, arrogant and impatient, became furious. He shouted, "If they won't eat, then let them drink." And he ordered his men to throw the sacred chickens overboard into the sea. The Roman soldiers were horrified. They believed Publius had just cursed the entire fleet. They went into battle demoralized, convinced they were doomed. They lost badly, 93 ships, nearly the entire fleet. Publius was recalled to Rome in disgrace, put on trial, and fined heavily. Some accounts say he died in exile, broken and humiliated. Did the gods actually punish Publius? Or did his soldiers fight half-heartedly because they believed they were cursed? Or did Publius himself make worse tactical decisions because he was angry and overconfident? The Romans learned a lesson. Respect the omens, not because they're necessarily real, but because believing in them keeps you humble. Careful prevents decisions made in the heat of anger. That's the hidden wisdom in many royal superstitions. They weren't just irrational fears. They were cultural technologies, systems designed to help fallible human beings make better decisions under crushing pressure. Sharing the burden. But they were something else too. They were a way to share the burden of responsibility. Think about it. If you're a king and you order your army into battle where thousands die, that weight is crushing. But if you consulted the omens first, if the augurs confirmed it was the right decision, if the gods themselves gave their approval, then the blood isn't entirely on your hands. You were following divine will. You were doing what the universe demanded. Superstitions gave rulers permission to be human, permission to be uncertain, permission to fail. Because if even the gods' plans are mysterious, then no one can expect you to be perfect. This is why royal superstitions persisted for thousands of years across every culture on Earth. They weren't signs of weakness. They were coping mechanisms for an impossible job. They were how human beings, with human fears and human limitations, tried to bear the weight of the crown. And that weight was real. Picture a Roman emperor lying awake at night in his palace. Outside, a million people sleep, trusting he'll keep them safe, fed, prosperous. But he's just a man. He gets scared. He doubts himself. He wonders if he's making the right choices. Then, just before dawn, he sees an eagle flying from left to right across his window. According to the augurs, that's a favorable sign. And suddenly, he can breathe again. The knot in his chest loosens. He's not alone in this decision. The gods are with him. He can face the day. Is that foolish? Or is that profoundly, achingly human? I think we judge these ancient rulers too harshly. We mock their superstitions from the comfortable distance of hindsight, but we forget they lived in a world far more terrifying than ours, where children died from diseases we cure with antibiotics, where famines wiped out entire populations, where there was no democracy, no term limits, no peaceful transfer of power, just the constant threat of assassination, rebellion, war. In that world, finding meaning in bird flight patterns doesn't seem strange. It seems like a lifeline, a way to find order in chaos, a way to believe that someone, somewhere, even if it's just the universe itself, is paying attention. The Pharaoh's curse. Now you might be wondering, what were these specific superstitions? How did they actually work? And what happened when rulers believed them so deeply that they changed the course of history? That's exactly where we're going next. We're traveling to Egypt, to a tomb that hadn't been opened in 3,000 years, and to the moment when archaeologists unleashed something newspapers around the world called the Pharaos curse. What happened next is stranger than any Hollywood movie. Take a deep breath. Let your mind settle into the darkness. And let's step into that ancient tomb together. November 4th, 1922. The Valley of the Kings, Egypt. A young boy carrying water for the excavation crew is walking across the desert sand when his foot strikes something solid. He brushes away sand with his hands and discovers what looks like a stone step. Just one step, carved into bedrock, leading down into darkness. He calls over the lead archaeologist, Howard Carter, who's been searching this valley for 6 years with nothing to show for it. 6 years of digging in scorching heat. 6 years of disappointing his wealthy sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, who's about to cut off funding. This is Carter's last season, his last chance. And now this boy has found a staircase buried for over 3,000 years. Can you imagine that moment? The realization that you might be standing at the entrance to something no living person has seen since the time of the Pharaohs. Carter's hands must have trembled as he cleared the sand away. 1 step became 2. 2 became 12. 16 steps total, leading down to a sealed doorway. And on that doorway, pressed into ancient plaster, were the unmistakable seals of the royal necropolis. Howard Carter had just discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun. But here's what makes this story haunting. The curse. The famous curse of the pharaohs that would terrify the world didn't start inside the tomb. It started that very first night. Carter owned a pet canary, a bright yellow bird that sang every morning, bringing what everyone called good luck to the dig site. The Egyptian workers loved that bird. When the tomb was discovered, they actually nicknamed it the Tomb of the Bird, believing the canary had guided them to it. That night, Carter returned to his house, probably unable to sleep, mind racing with what he'd found. And sometime in those dark hours before dawn, a cobra, a snake that hadn't been seen in the area in years, somehow entered his house, found the birdcage, and killed the canary. The Egyptian workers saw this the next morning, and they knew exactly what it meant. The cobra wasn't just any snake. In ancient Egypt, the cobra was the symbol of royalty, appearing on every pharaoh's crown. The uraeus, representing the protective goddess who destroyed the pharaoh's enemies. The royal cobra that strikes at anyone who threatens the king. The pharaoh has sent his guardian, the workers whispered. The cobra has come to punish those who disturb the tomb. Carter dismissed this as superstition. Of course he did. He was a scientist, an archaeologist, a rational man of the modern age. Tommy rot, he called it, British slang for nonsense. But notice something. The curse began with the people who believed in it, the ones who understood the old symbols, the ones who still remembered that tombs weren't just graves. They were sacred spaces protected by magic and divine will. Carter didn't believe. Not yet. Wonderful things. 3 weeks later, Lord Carnarvon arrived from England. On November 26, 1922, they broke through the sealed doorway. Carter made a small hole, just big enough to hold up a candle and peer inside. "Can you see anything?" Carnarvon asked, barely containing his excitement. And Carter, his eye pressed to that small opening, his candle flickering across treasures that hadn't seen light in 33 centuries, could only whisper, "Yes, wonderful things." The tomb was intact, almost completely intact. The first royal Egyptian tomb ever found that hadn't been looted in ancient times. Golden statues, jewelry, chariots, thrones, beds, shaped like sacred animals. And everywhere, the image of the young pharaoh, Tutankhamun, the boy king who died at 19, whose tomb had been lost and forgotten for over 3,000 years. But here's what they didn't tell the newspapers at first. When they entered the burial chamber itself, when they finally reached the room where Tutankhamun's mummy lay sealed in nested coffins of gold, there were 2 life-size statues standing guard. Black statues with gold sandals and gold crowns, each crown decorated with cobras. Those cobras again, watching, waiting. You have to understand the media frenzy that followed. This wasn't just an archaeological discovery. It was a global sensation. Remember, this is 1922. The world has just survived the horror of World War I. People are desperate for wonder, for mystery, for something that reminds them there's magic left in the world. And here comes this tomb, this impossible treasure, this glimpse into a civilization so ancient and powerful that it feels like touching immortality itself. Newspapers sent reporters from around the world. The discovery was front-page news everywhere. People were obsessed. Egyptomania, they called it. Fashion designers made Egyptian-inspired dresses. Architects designed buildings with Egyptian motifs. Everyone wanted a piece of this ancient glory. But then, the deaths started. The first death. 4 months after entering the tomb, Lord Carnarvon, the man who funded the entire expedition, got a mosquito bite on his cheek. Just a little bite, nothing serious. While shaving one morning, he accidentally cut it open. The cut became infected. The infection spread to his blood. He developed pneumonia. And on April 5, 1923, in a Cairo hotel room, Lord Carnarvon died of blood poisoning at the age of 57. Now, here's where the story gets strange enough that you might not believe me. But I promise this is documented. At the exact moment Carnarvon died, and I mean the exact moment, all the lights in Cairo went out. A complete power outage, plunging the entire city into darkness. And back in England, at Carnarvon's estate, his favorite dog, a terrier that had lived its entire life in that house, suddenly let out a long, mournful howl and dropped dead. The newspapers went absolutely wild. A novelist named Marie Corelli, who had never even visited Egypt, claimed she owned an ancient book called The Egyptian History of the Pyramids. She wrote letters to newspapers warning that the most dire punishment follows any rash intruder into a sealed tomb. She quoted her mysterious book, "Secret poisons enclosed in boxes in such wise that those who touch them shall not know how they come to suffer." Was this true? Did such a book exist? Probably not. But nobody cared. The story was too good, too terrifying, too perfect. And then more people connected to the tomb started dying. George J. Gould, an American financier who visited the tomb in 1923, developed a fever shortly after and died 4 months later. Aubrey Herbert, Lord Carnarvon's half-brother, died in September 1923 of blood poisoning, the same way as his brother. Sir Archibald Douglas Reid, who X-rayed Tutankhamun's mummy, died in 1924 under mysterious circumstances. Arthur Mace, a member of Carter's excavation team, fell into a coma for no apparent reason and died without ever waking up. Even the radiologist who examined the mummy died shortly after, and his assistant, and the person who cataloged the tomb's artifacts. The list kept growing. The newspapers kept counting, and with each death, the legend of the curse grew stronger. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, yes, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, publicly stated he believed in the curse. He theorized that ancient Egyptian priests had created elementals, basically magical guardians, specifically designed to protect the tomb and punish anyone who violated it. Benito Mussolini, the Italian dictator, became so terrified that when someone gave him an Egyptian mummy as a gift, he ordered it immediately removed from his palace. He wanted nothing to do with anything that might be cursed. The world was convinced. The curse of the Pharaohs was real. The truth behind the terror. But here's where we need to pause and look at the actual facts. Because this is where superstition meets statistics, and the truth is far more interesting than the myth. Out of the 58 people who were present when the tomb and sarcophagus were first opened, 58 people who had direct contact with the mummy and the sealed chambers, only 8 died within the next 12 years. 8 out of 58. That's actually lower than the normal death rate for that time period, especially for people doing physically demanding work in Egypt's harsh climate. Howard Carter himself, the man who spent more time in that tomb than anyone, who personally unwrapped the mummy, who handled every artifact, lived for 17 more years. He didn't die until 1939 at the age of 64 from lymphoma, a disease that has nothing to do with curses and everything to do with biology. Lady Evelyn Herbert, Lord Carnarvon's daughter, was one of the very first people to enter the tomb. She lived until 1980, 57 years after supposedly being cursed. She died at age 79. The last survivor connected to the tomb's opening was Richard Adamson, a British soldier who actually guarded the burial chamber for 7 years straight. He was stationed inside that tomb, breathing its air, touching its walls, closer to Tutankhamun's mummy than almost anyone. He died in 1982, 60 years after the curse supposedly began, at the age of 80. So if there was a curse, it was terrible at its job. But you know what's really fascinating? There actually is a scientific explanation for some of the deaths. And it's almost scarier than magic. When archaeologists opened ancient tombs sealed for thousands of years, they were potentially exposing themselves to something genuinely dangerous. Ancient pathogens, bacteria, and mold that had been growing in the darkness for millennia. Scientists have found that some mummies carry aspergillus, a type of toxic mold that can cause serious respiratory problems, and even death in people with weakened immune systems. Remember, Lord Carnarvon wasn't a healthy man to begin with. He'd been in a serious car accident years earlier and had chronic breathing problems. That mosquito bite and subsequent infection might have been worsened by exposure to bacteria in the tomb. There's also another factor nobody talks about. The tombs themselves could have dangerous levels of ammonia, formaldehyde, and hydrogen sulfide, gases created by the decomposition process and trapped in sealed chambers for centuries. Breathing that air isn't cursed. It's just toxic. But here's the thing. Even though we know all of this now, even though we can explain the deaths scientifically, the curse narrative was so powerful that it changed how people thought about Egypt forever. And you know why it worked. Because people wanted to believe in it. Why we needed the curse. Think about it. The world in the 1920s was disillusioned. They just watched millions die in a pointless war. Modern technology, the thing that was supposed to save humanity, had been used to create machine guns, poison gas, and bombers. Science had lost some of its shine. So when this story came along, this story about ancient wisdom and ancient power that modern man couldn't understand or control, people grabbed onto it. It was a reminder that there were still mysteries in the world. That maybe the old ways, the old gods, the old magic still had power. That humanity's arrogance and greed, breaking into a sacred tomb for treasure, could still be punished by forces beyond our understanding. The curse gave meaning to random deaths. It created a narrative where there was justice, even if it was supernatural justice. But here's what really gets me. There was no curse inscription found in Tutankhamun's tomb. None. Despite what the newspapers claimed, despite what movies later showed, there was no tablet saying, "Death shall come on swift wings to he who disturbs the peace of the king." That cursed text? Completely made up. Probably by a journalist who knew a good story when he saw one. Now, there were curse inscriptions in some other ancient Egyptian tombs. The tomb of Kentika Ikeki, for example, had hieroglyphs that basically said, "As for anyone who enters this tomb while being impure, I will seize his neck like a bird and cast fear into him," which you have to admit is pretty dramatic for ancient Egypt. But those curses weren't about revenge. They were warnings to other Egyptians, specifically to priests and workers who might be tempted to loot the tomb or neglect the offerings. They were essentially ancient no trespassing signs. The ancient Egyptians didn't believe their curses would activate 3,000 years later when foreign archaeologists showed up. That's a modern invention. So what really happened? Why did this become the most famous curse in history? I think there are 3 reasons. First, timing. The discovery happened at exactly the right moment in history, when people were hungry for wonder and mystery. Second, selective memory. We remember the deaths connected to the curse. We forget the 50 people who lived long, healthy lives after entering the tomb. And third, and this is the one that matters most, we need stories like this. We need to believe that some things are still sacred, that there are boundaries we shouldn't cross. That power, especially ancient power, demands respect. Howard Carter understood this. Actually, despite dismissing the curse publicly, he wrote something fascinating in his journals. He said that the sentiment of an Egyptologist is not one of fear, but of respect and awe, entirely opposed to foolish superstitions. Respect and awe. Maybe that's what the curse was really about. Not punishment, but a reminder that we're standing in the presence of something larger than ourselves. That these tombs aren't just historical artifacts, they're the final resting places of people who believed their souls would live forever, who put their faith, their treasures, their hopes for eternity into these sealed chambers. And we just walked in, took what we wanted, put it in museums halfway around the world. Maybe the curse wasn't supernatural. Maybe it was just guilt dressed up as fear. One last whisper. I'll leave you with one final image. Years after the tomb was opened, years after the deaths and headlines had faded, Howard Carter was asked if he ever felt afraid in the tomb, if he ever felt the presence of something watching. He paused for a long time before answering. Once, he said, in the darkness, arranging some artifacts near the burial chamber, I heard a sound behind me, like a whisper, like breath. I turned with my lamp, and there was nothing there. Nothing but shadows and gold and a boy king who'd been dead for 33 centuries. He smiled then, but it didn't reach his eyes. I told myself it was the wind through the passages. But in that moment, just for a moment, I understood why the workers were afraid. The curse of the Pharaos, real or imagined, scientific or supernatural, we may never know for certain. But what we do know is that it changed history. It made us question our relationship with the ancient world. It reminded us that some mysteries refuse to be solved, no matter how much light we shine on them. And here I must pause, for this journey through royal superstitions continues deeper still. We've only begun to explore the strange beliefs that shaped kingdoms and toppled thrones. In the coming sections, we'll meet Alexander the Great and his prophet, venture into Chinese palaces where empresses read the stars, witness medieval kings paralyzed by celestial signs, and stand beside the Romanovs as they place their faith in a Siberian mystic. But for now, take a breath. Let these stories settle. And when you're ready, we'll continue into even stranger territories of belief and power. Alexander and his prophet. Now let's turn our gaze to a conqueror who refused to launch a single military campaign without consulting the birds first. A man who believed the gods spoke to him through eagles and thunder, who carried a personal prophet everywhere he went, and who once turned back from a major battle because a swallow flew the wrong direction. His name was Alexander, and his superstitions didn't just shape his own fate, they changed the entire world. The wait of 22 years. Picture this, you're 22 years old. You've just inherited an empire, and you're about to attempt something no one in history has ever accomplished, conquering the known world. Every decision you make could mean the difference between eternal glory and catastrophic failure. Thousands of soldiers look to you for leadership. Enemies surround you on all sides. And you're still young enough that some question whether you're even ready to rule. How do you handle that pressure? How do you trust yourself to make the right call when the stakes are literally life and death? If you're Alexander of Macedon, you don't trust yourself alone. You bring along a man named Aristander, Alexander III of Macedon. Alexander the Great is remembered as one of history's most brilliant military commanders. By the time he died at age 32, he'd created an empire stretching from Greece to India, covering over 2 million square miles. He never lost a battle. Never. He defeated the mighty Persian Empire, conquered Egypt, crossed the Hindu Kush Mountains, and went places no Greek had ever gone before. But here's what they don't always tell you in the history books. Alexander didn't make a single major decision without consulting omens. Not one. And the man who interpreted those omens, Aristander of Telmessus, was arguably the second most important person in Alexander's entire campaign. Not his generals, not his advisors, his prophet, a lion's birth. Let me tell you how this relationship began, because it's fascinating. Before Alexander was even born, his father, Philip II of Macedon, had a strange dream. In the dream, Philip saw himself sealing up his wife Olympias's womb with a seal that bore the image of a lion. He woke troubled, not knowing what this meant. Was his wife pregnant? If so, what did the lion symbolize? Philip called for Aristander, who was already serving as the royal seer. And Aristander's interpretation was brilliant. "Your wife is indeed pregnant," he said. "And the lion seal means you will have a son who will be brave and fierce as a lion." Sure enough, Olympias gave birth to a boy, Alexander. And from that moment on, Aristander was woven into Alexander's destiny. He'd predicted Alexander's birth. He'd promised he would be lion-hearted. Can you imagine growing up with that prophecy hanging over you? The pressure to live up to it. The comfort of believing you were marked for greatness before you were even born. Alexander kept Aristander by his side his entire life. And I mean entire life. From childhood through every battle, every campaign, right up until Alexander's death in Babylon. Aristander was more than a fortune teller. He was a psychological strategist, a morale officer, and possibly the only person Alexander truly believed could communicate with the gods. The warning of the swallow. Let me give you an example of how this actually worked. When Alexander was planning his first major campaign into Asia, he decided to visit Troy, the legendary city from Homer's Iliad. This wasn't just tourism. Alexander believed he was descended from Achilles. He saw himself as continuing the ancient Greek hero's legacy. So paying respects at Troy was deeply important to him. The night before leaving Troy, Alexander was trying to sleep in his tent when a swallow kept bothering him. You know how annoying a bird can be when it's flying around inside, chirping, fluttering, bumping into things. Alexander kept trying to wave it away, but the bird was persistent. Finally, he called for Aristander. "What does this mean?" Aristander watched the swallow for a few moments, noting its behavior, its flight pattern, how insistent it was. Then he said, "This bird is trying to warn you. There's a conspiracy against your life. Someone close to you is planning betrayal. But because the bird came to you openly, the plot will be revealed before it can succeed." Alexander took this seriously. He ordered his security doubled. His guards questioned everyone in the inner circle. And sure enough, they discovered that a group of soldiers had been planning to assassinate him. The conspiracy was stopped before Alexander was ever in real danger. Now, was this actually divine intervention? Or did Aristander notice something suspicious in the camp and use the swallow as a convenient excuse to investigate? We'll never know. But here's what matters. Alexander believed, and that belief kept him alive. Blood in the bread. But the most famous omen in Alexander's entire campaign happened during the siege of Tyre in 332 BCE. Tyre was a wealthy Phoenician city built on an island, surrounded by water, with massive walls that had withstood countless sieges. It was considered virtually impregnable. Alexander demanded they surrender. They refused. So Alexander did something insane. He built a causeway, a bridge of earth and stone stretching from the mainland to the island. It took months. The Tyrians attacked constantly, setting fire to his siege equipment, killing his workers. The siege was taking forever. Alexander's men were exhausted and demoralized. They were starting to wonder if Tyre could actually be conquered. Then something strange happened. The soldiers were distributing the daily bread rations when someone noticed that some of the loaves were bleeding. Not just stained red, actively bleeding, with liquid dripping from fresh bread. The army panicked. This was clearly an omen. But was it good or bad? Blood could mean death. It could mean sacrifice. It could mean the gods were angry. What did it mean? Aristander examined the bloody bread carefully. He asked questions. Where was the blood located? Inside the bread or on the surface? The blood is on the inside, the soldiers told him. And Aristander smiled. Then, this is a favorable omen. Blood on the inside of the bread means that blood will be spilled inside the city, meaning we will breach the walls and conquer Tyre. The army's mood shifted instantly. They went from despair to confidence. They attacked with renewed vigor, and Alexander did conquer Tyre in one of the most impressive sieges in ancient history. Did the bloody bread actually predict victory? Or did Aristander's interpretation motivate the soldiers to fight harder, which led to victory? Again, it doesn't really matter. The omen worked. The eagle at Gaugamela. But my favorite story, the one that really shows how deep Alexander's belief went, happened right before the Battle of Gaugamela. We touched on the eclipse earlier, but there's so much more to this story. It's October 1st, 331 BC. Alexander is camped with his army, preparing to face Darius III of Persia in what will be the decisive battle of the war. Darius has assembled the largest army ever seen. Estimates suggest over 100,000 infantry, 40,000 cavalry, 200 war chariots with scythe attached to the wheels, and 15 war elephants. Alexander has maybe 47,000 men total. He's outnumbered more than 2 to 1. The night before the battle, Alexander can't sleep. Neither can his soldiers. Everyone knows that tomorrow they'll either become legends or die in the Persian desert. Alexander calls for Aristander. They perform sacrifices together, watching how the animals die, examining the livers and organs for signs. Ancient cultures believed you could read the future in the entrails of sacrificial animals. If the liver was healthy and normal, the gods were pleased. If it was diseased or misshapen, danger was coming. The sacrifices are favorable, but Alexander still seems uncertain. Then, just before dawn, Aristander points to the sky. An eagle, the sacred bird of Zeus, king of the gods, is circling directly above Alexander's tent. And as the sun rises, the eagle flies toward the Persian camp. There, Aristander says, Zeus himself sends his messenger. The eagle flies toward your enemies, which means you will strike them down. The king of birds heralds the victory of the king of men. Alexander finally relaxes. He actually manages to sleep for a few hours, something his generals later said was remarkable given the circumstances. And when the battle begins, Alexander is calm, focused, brilliant. And here's the detail that gives me chills. During the actual battle, in the midst of chaos and violence and dust and blood, multiple soldiers later reported seeing an eagle flying directly above Alexander's head the entire time, following him as he charged, hovering over him like a guardian spirit. Was it the same eagle Aristander pointed out? Was it a different bird? Was it even real? Or did soldiers see what they wanted to see in the heat of battle? What we know for certain is this. Alexander won at Gaugamela decisively, against impossible odds, and his soldiers believed the gods had been with them. When the gods say no, but omens didn't always go Alexander's way. And when they didn't, even Alexander the Great had to listen. In 329 BC, Alexander wanted to cross the Tanais River, what we now call the Sir Daria, to chase down some Scythian horsemen who'd been harassing his army. The Scythians were hit-and-run experts, incredibly dangerous, and Alexander was angry. He wanted revenge. He ordered Aristander to take the auspices, to perform the sacrifices, and read the omens. Aristander did, and he came back with bad news. The omens are unfavorable. The gods say you should not cross the river today. Alexander, for the first time in years, got angry at his prophet. Take them again. Aristander sacrificed more animals, watched their death throes, examined their organs, and returned with the same answer. The omens are still unfavorable. Crossing this river will bring disaster. And here's where it gets interesting. Alexander crossed anyway. He was so furious, so determined to punish the Scythians, that he ignored the divine warning. He took his army across the Tanais River and engaged the enemy. The battle was a nightmare. Alexander himself got hit in the neck with an arrow. The wound was serious enough that he nearly died. Many of his soldiers fell. The Scythians employed tactics Alexander wasn't prepared for. It wasn't a defeat. Alexander technically won, but it was the closest he'd come to losing in years. And when he returned to camp, wounded and shaken, he apologized to Aristander. "You were right. I should have listened to the gods." From that point on, Alexander never ignored unfavorable omens again. Think about what this means. We're talking about one of the most powerful military commanders in human history. Someone who conquered most of the known world. Someone who believed he was descended from gods. And he was genuinely afraid of birds flying the wrong direction. That's not weakness. That's the weight of responsibility made visible. The burden of command. Every battle Alexander fought, he was gambling with thousands of lives. Every decision could mean the difference between empire and extinction. And unlike modern generals, with reconnaissance satellites and weather reports and encrypted communications, Alexander had to make decisions based on incomplete information in hostile territory, surrounded by people who wanted him dead. The omens gave him a framework for decision-making. They gave him a way to slow down and think. They gave him permission to change his mind. The gods say we should wait, without looking weak. And maybe most importantly, they gave him a way to share the burden of command. If Alexander made a wrong decision, it wasn't entirely his fault. The omens had been misread. But if he made a right decision, he could share the glory with the divine. It was a brilliant psychological strategy, whether he realized it or not. The final prophecy. There's one last story I have to tell you about Alexander and Aristander, because it's both beautiful and heartbreaking. After Alexander died in Babylon at age 32, probably from typhoid fever, though some say poison, there was immediately a massive fight over his body. See, whoever controlled Alexander's corpse controlled legitimacy. Every general wanted to claim they were his true heir. Aristander, now an old man, made one final prophecy. He stood before the gathered generals and said, "The land that holds Alexander's body will be prosperous and unconquerable forever." Then he added, almost as a warning, "But you should be ashamed, fighting over his corpse like dogs, while his empire tears itself apart." This is not what he would have wanted. Eventually, Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, stole the body and brought it to Egypt, to Alexandria. And that city remained powerful and prosperous for centuries afterward, just as Aristander predicted. Aristander himself disappeared from history after that. We don't know when or how he died. He just faded away, his purpose fulfilled. But his legacy remained, because Alexander's use of omens, his reliance on divine signs, his belief that the gods spoke through birds and thunder and dreams, this became the model for rulers across the ancient world. Roman generals started bringing augurs on military campaigns. Persian kings consulted astrologers before battles. Chinese emperors watched the heavens for celestial approval. Alexander proved that superstition and strategy could work together. That faith and ambition weren't opposites. They were fuel for the same fire. And that fire burned bright enough to light up the ancient world. The mandate of heaven. While Alexander was watching birds in the west, there was an entire empire in the east that had perfected a different kind of divine observation. An empire where the emperor himself was considered the bridge between heaven and earth. Where natural disasters weren't just bad luck. They were direct messages from the cosmos, warning that something had gone terribly wrong with the kingdom. An empire where one woman would manipulate these celestial superstitions so skillfully that she'd become China's only female emperor, ruling with absolute power while the stars themselves seemed to bless her reign. The Son of Heaven. There's a concept in ancient Chinese philosophy that Western rulers never quite grasped. It's called Tiaming, the mandate of heaven. And it's perhaps the most elegant and terrifying superstition ever created by any civilization. Here's how it worked. The emperor wasn't just a political leader. He was literally the bridge between heaven and earth. The Son of Heaven, they called him. And as long as he ruled justly, the cosmos itself would remain in harmony. The rains would come on time. The harvests would be abundant. The rivers would stay in their banks. Peace would reign. But if the emperor was corrupt, incompetent, or cruel, heaven would send warnings. Earthquakes, floods, droughts, solar eclipses, comets with long blood-red tails streaking across the night sky. These weren't just natural disasters. They were heaven's way of saying, fix this or we'll find someone else to wear the crown. And here's the truly revolutionary part. This meant that any emperor could lose the mandate. It didn't matter if you were born into the royal family. It didn't matter if your ancestors had ruled for generations. If heaven withdrew its blessing, your dynasty was finished. And whoever overthrew you, well, clearly they had the new mandate. Otherwise, how could they have succeeded? It was a superstition that made revolution theologically acceptable. A belief system that kept emperors awake at night, watching the sky, terrified of what the stars might reveal. Impossible rise. Now, imagine being a Chinese emperor in the 7th century AD. You wake up every morning knowing that a single earthquake could be interpreted as heaven's judgment against you. Every comet, every eclipse, every unusual weather pattern becomes a political crisis. You have teams of imperial astronomers whose entire job is to watch the sky and report any celestial irregularities. Because if they miss something and rumors start spreading that heaven is angry, you could have a rebellion on your hands. The pressure must have been absolutely suffocating. But one person figured out how to not just survive this system, but manipulate it so brilliantly that she became the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. Not as a regent or empress consort, but as the actual emperor. Her name was Wu Zetian, and her story is one of the most fascinating examples of weaponized superstition you'll ever hear. Wu Zetian was born in 624 AD into a wealthy but not aristocratic family. Her father was a timber merchant who got lucky and ended up in the imperial court. At age 14, Wu was selected as a low-ranking concubine for Emperor Taizong. She was beautiful, yes, but so were hundreds of other women in the palace. What set Wu apart was her mind. She was literate, rare for women at that time, ambitious, and absolutely ruthless. When Emperor Taizong died, Wu did something scandalous. Instead of becoming a Buddhist nun, as custom required for imperial concubines, she seduced Taizong's son, the new emperor, Zhaozong. Within a few years, she'd maneuvered herself from concubine to consort to empress. And when Gaozong's health started failing, Wu gradually took over actual governance of the empire. But here's the problem. China had never had a female ruler. The entire Confucian philosophical system that governed Chinese society was built on the idea that women should be subordinate to men. A woman on the throne? That violated the natural order. That was the kind of thing that would make heaven itself revolt in disgust. So Wu needed to prove that heaven approved of her rule. She needed omens. Good ones. Lots of them. And if heaven wasn't providing them naturally, well, she'd just have to help heaven along, manufacturing divine approval. In 688 AD, a Buddhist monk discovered an ancient text called the Great Cloud Sutra. This text conveniently contained a prophecy that a woman would one day rule China as a reincarnation of the Bodhisattva Maitreya, the future Buddha. The monk presented this text to Wu Zetian, declaring that she was obviously the woman the prophecy spoke of. Was this a genuine ancient text? Almost certainly not. Was the monk working for Wu? Almost certainly, yes. But that didn't matter. Wu ordered copies of this sutra distributed throughout the empire. She built Buddhist temples everywhere, each one spreading the message that her rule was divinely ordained. But Wu didn't stop with religious texts. She needed natural omens too, the kind that couldn't be faked, or at least, that couldn't be proven to be faked. In the year 690 AD, right before Wu officially declared herself emperor, a series of remarkable events occurred. And I want you to notice the timing, because it's almost too perfect to be coincidental. First, a farmer discovered a white deer wandering near the capital. Now, in Chinese tradition, a white deer was an incredibly auspicious omen. It meant that a sage ruler had brought such harmony to the world that even magical creatures appeared to honor them. The farmer brought the white deer to the palace. Wu Zetian appeared before the court, received the deer with great ceremony, and declared this a sign of heaven's approval. The court astronomers agreed. This was clearly an omen of cosmic blessing. 2 months later, a fisherman caught a giant fish in the Yellow River, a fish larger than any seen in living memory. He presented it to the empress. Another auspicious omen. The rivers themselves were providing abundance under her rule. Then, and this is where it gets really interesting, a group of monks claimed to have found unusual mushrooms growing in the sacred mountains. These weren't ordinary mushrooms. They were lingji, mushrooms of immortality. In Chinese tradition, lingji only grew in places of perfect natural harmony, where the connection between heaven and earth was especially strong. The monks brought the mushrooms to Wu. She declared that these were proof that the sacred mountains themselves recognized her virtue. Now here's the question. Were these omens genuine? Or did Wu Zetian orchestrate the entire thing? Think about it. A white deer appears exactly when she needs one. You don't think maybe someone in her employ captured a deer, had it dyed, or painted white, and released it near where a loyal farmer would discover it? The giant fish. You don't think maybe the imperial fisheries had been saving their largest catch for the right political moment? The magic mushrooms growing on sacred mountains, visited only by monks who depended on imperial patronage. Really. But here's the brilliant part. Nobody could prove they were fake. And even if people suspected, what were they going to say? I think the Empress is fabricating divine omens. That's treason. That's saying heaven doesn't approve of the ruler. That's the kind of talk that gets your entire family executed. So the omens kept coming. And in 690 AD, Wu Zetian did something no woman had ever done in Chinese history. She declared herself Huangdi, emperor, not empress, emperor. She changed the name of the dynasty from Tang to Zhou. She claimed the mandate of heaven for herself. And the remarkable thing? She got away with it. She ruled as emperor for 15 years, from 690 to 705 AD. And her reign was actually pretty successful. She reformed the government, promoted talented administrators regardless of their background, expanded the empire's borders, and kept the economy stable. But she never stopped manufacturing omens, because the moment heaven seemed to turn against her, her legitimacy would crumble. When heaven turns. And heaven did eventually turn. Or at least, heaven gave her enemies an opportunity. In 701 AD, there was a severe earthquake in northern China. The ground split open, buildings collapsed, hundreds of people died, and earthquakes, in Chinese cosmology, were particularly bad omens. They suggested that the earth itself was rebelling against heaven's order, which meant the emperor had lost the mandate. Wu's political enemies immediately started whispering, "Heaven is angry. A woman on the throne has disrupted the cosmic order. The earthquake is a warning." Wu had to respond quickly. She couldn't deny the earthquake had happened. Too many people had experienced it. So instead, she reframed it. She issued an imperial edict, taking full responsibility for the disaster. She announced that clearly she must have made some error in governance that displeased heaven. Therefore, she was reducing taxes, releasing prisoners, and inviting scholars to submit criticisms of her policies so she could correct her mistakes and restore harmony. Brilliant, right? She turned a sign of heaven's anger into proof of her humility and virtue. She showed that she was listening to heaven's warnings and taking action. The crisis passed, but the earthquake had planted seeds of doubt. And as Wu got older, as her health declined, those doubts grew. There were whispers in the court. Maybe it was time for the mandate to pass to someone else. Maybe heaven was ready for a change. In 705 AD, when Wu was 80 years old and seriously ill, there was a coup. A group of officials forced her to abdicate, restoring the Tang dynasty under her son. Wu died a few months later, the only woman to ever hold the title of Chinese emperor. The genius and the trap. And you know what's fascinating? After she died, the official histories written about her were surprisingly balanced. Yes, they criticized her for being ruthless, for manipulating religion and omens to suit her purposes. But they also acknowledged that her reign had been prosperous, that she had been a capable administrator. The historical consensus seemed to be, maybe heaven did approve of her after all. Because if heaven hadn't, how could she have succeeded? That's the genius and the trap of the mandate of heaven. It's unfalsifiable. If you win, you had the mandate. If you lose, you didn't. Success becomes its own justification. But the constant need to read and respond to celestial signs that created a fascinating relationship between Chinese emperors and the natural world. They weren't just watching for omens. They were in constant dialogue with the cosmos. This pattern repeated throughout Chinese history. Earthquakes, eclipses, comets, all became political crises that emperors had to navigate carefully. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they fell. But always, they were watching the sky, listening for heaven's voice, trying to read the signs before it was too late. And perhaps that wasn't entirely foolish. Perhaps it created a system where even absolute rulers felt accountable to something beyond themselves, where power came with cosmic responsibility, where the stars themselves sat in judgment. Medieval Europe, dreams and darkness. If you think Chinese emperors were paranoid about celestial signs, wait until you hear about medieval European kings. Because in medieval Europe, God wasn't just watching from a distance. He was actively intervening in daily life, sending messages through every crack in reality. And these messages weren't subtle philosophical concepts about cosmic harmony. They were visceral, terrifying, personal warnings that someone specific was about to die. The medieval Christian worldview saw the universe as a battleground between God and Satan, between angels and demons, between salvation and damnation. And every unusual event, every dream, every comet, every birth defect in livestock, every storm, every dead bird found in the palace was a message in that cosmic war. This wasn't abstract theology. This was the operating system of medieval politics. The Nightmare King. Let me show you what I mean with a story that changed the course of English history. It's August 21st, 1485, the night before the Battle of Bosworth Field. King Richard III of England is camped with his army, preparing for what will be the decisive battle of the Wars of the Roses. Richard is defending his crown against a challenger named Henry Tudor, who's invaded from France with a much smaller army. On paper, Richard should win easily. He has more soldiers, better equipment, strong defensive positions. But Richard can't sleep. According to multiple historical accounts, including those of people who were actually in the camp that night, the king is tormented by nightmares. In his dreams, Richard sees the ghosts of everyone he supposedly murdered to get the throne. His brother's two young sons, the famous princes in the tower, appear as pale corpses, pointing at him with skeletal fingers. His wife Anne appears, accusing him of poisoning her. Former allies he'd executed come one by one, each whispering the same prophecy. Tomorrow, you will die. Richard wakes up screaming. Multiple times, his servants hear him thrashing in his tent. By dawn, he's pale, sweating, barely coherent. His commanders notice immediately. The king looks haunted, terrified. And in an era where soldiers believed that God determined the outcome of battles, a king who looked like he'd been cursed by ghosts? That was a terrible omen. The battle begins, and everything goes wrong for Richard. Soldiers who are supposed to support him hesitate. Allies switch sides at crucial moments. Richard's horse gets stuck in marshy ground, and Richard himself, whether from exhaustion, from the lingering terror of his nightmares, or from genuine divine intervention, makes tactical errors he never would have made in his right mind. He sees Henry Tudor across the battlefield, exposed with just a small bodyguard, and Richard makes a desperate, reckless cavalry charge, trying to kill Henry personally. It's not strategic. It's the action of a man who's already lost, who knows he's doomed, who's trying to change fate through sheer violent will. Richard is killed. His crown is literally found in a thorn bush on the battlefield and placed on Henry Tudor's head. Henry becomes King Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty. Did Richard's nightmare predict his death? Or did the nightmare, the psychological trauma of it, the lack of sleep, the terror, cause him to make decisions that led to his death? Here's the fascinating part. Henry Tudor's supporters immediately used Richard's nightmare as propaganda. They said, "See, God himself sent those ghosts to punish Richard for his crimes." The nightmare was divine judgment made visible, and Richard's nightmare became proof that he'd been an illegitimate king all along, that heaven itself had rejected him. The dream retroactively justified the entire rebellion. That's how powerful dream omens were in medieval Europe. They could literally rewrite the legitimacy of dynasties. Stars with tails. But nightmares weren't the only omens that terrified medieval rulers. Comets were even worse. In 1066, yes, one of the most famous years in English history, a comet appeared in the sky above England. We know now that it was Halley's Comet, which appears roughly every 75-76 years as it orbits the sun. But to medieval people, comets were terrifying anomalies. They were stars that suddenly developed long blazing tails and moved across the sky in ways that violated all understanding of how the heavens should work. The medieval interpretation was unanimous. Comets announced disaster, plague, the death of kings. They were literally called disaster stars, from the Latin disastrum, meaning bad star. When Halley's Comet appeared in April 1066, everyone in England knew something terrible was coming. The question was, what? King Harold Godwinson had just taken the English throne in January, after the previous king, Edward the Confessor, died without an heir. Harold's claim to the throne was questionable. He wasn't royal blood. He was a powerful noble who'd essentially seized power. And the comet appearing just months into his reign? That looked really, really bad. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a historical record kept by monks, describes the comet in absolutely terrified terms. Over all England, such a sign in the heavens was seen as no man ever before saw. Some said it was the star Comet, which some men call the long-haired star, and it first appeared on the eve of the festival of Latania Mire, that is on the 24th of April, and so shone all the week. Harold's advisors were panicking. The common people were panicking. Priests were preaching that God was angry, that England was about to be punished for some great sin. And you know what? They were right to panic, because that same year, within months of the comet's appearance, England was invaded twice. First, by Harald Hardrada of Norway in the north, then by William of Normandy in the south. Harold defeated the Norwegian invasion, but he was killed fighting William at the Battle of Hastings in October. William the Conqueror became King of England. The entire Anglo-Saxon nobility was destroyed. The Norman conquest completely transformed English language, culture, law, and society. It was arguably the most important event in English history, and everyone remembered that it had been predicted by a comet. The Bayeux Tapestry, a massive embroidered cloth that depicts the Norman conquest, actually includes an image of the comet. You can see it stitched in thread, a blazing star with a long tail. And below it, people pointing in terror. Below that, ships preparing for invasion. The tapestry makers wanted everyone to remember. The comet announced this catastrophe. God had warned England, and England hadn't listened. The self-fulfilling prophecy. But here's a question that should trouble us. Did the comet actually cause anything? Or did people's belief in the comet's meaning change how they acted, which then created the predicted disaster? Think about it. Harold saw the comet. He knew everyone interpreted it as a sign of his coming downfall. That had to affect his psychology, his decision-making, his ability to inspire confidence in his troops. If you're a soldier fighting for a king who you believe has been cosmically cursed, how hard are you going to fight? And on the other side, William of Normandy could use the comet as propaganda. See? Heaven itself announces that Harold is illegitimate. God wants me to be King of England. This invasion isn't rebellion, it's divine will. The omen became a weapon, a psychological warfare tool that was arguably more effective than any sword. Medieval rulers were so terrified of comets that they developed elaborate rituals to try to ward off the disasters they announced. When comets appeared, kings would order days of fasting and prayer throughout the kingdom. They'd make donations to churches and monasteries, hoping to appease God's anger. They'd sometimes even abdicate temporarily, claiming they were unworthy, hoping that displays of humility would change heaven's plans. But comets, at least, appeared in the sky where everyone could see them and interpret them communally. Dreams were more personal, more intimate, and somehow more terrifying because they happened inside your own mind. The power of dreams. Medieval kings took their dreams with deadly seriousness. They kept dream interpreters at court, usually monks or clergy, who claimed special knowledge of biblical dream symbolism. And these interpreters had enormous power, because a single dream interpretation could determine whether a king went to war, made peace, executed someone, or changed policy entirely. There's a story about Charlemagne, Charles the Great, king of the Franks, and first Holy Roman Emperor, that perfectly illustrates this. Late in his life, probably around 813 AD, Charlemagne had a recurring dream. In the dream, he was riding his horse when suddenly a sword appeared in the sky, blazing with fire, with words written on the blade in letters of flame. The words kept changing, but they always spoke of death, judgment, and the end of his empire. Charlemagne was deeply disturbed by this dream. He called for his advisors, his bishops, his wise men. What did it mean? Was God warning him that his death was approaching? Was the empire about to crumble? The interpretations varied, but most agreed on one thing. Charlemagne needed to prepare for death. He needed to get his affairs in order, divide his empire among his sons, make peace with God. Charlemagne did exactly that. He drew up elaborate succession plans. He made huge donations to the church. He spent his final year in intense religious devotion, preparing his soul for judgment. And in January 814 AD, he died. The dream had been correct. But here's the question. Did the dream predict his death? Or did an old man, already feeling his health decline, have anxiety dreams that reflected his unconscious awareness that his time was running short? And did acting on those dreams, dividing the empire, essentially giving up power, actually accelerate his decline? We'll never know. But within a generation of Charlemagne's death, his empire had fractured into pieces. The unity he created was gone. And people looked back and said, the flaming sword dream predicted it all. God had warned Charlemagne that his empire wouldn't last. The birds of death. Not all omens were cosmic, though. Some were small, intimate, almost absurdly specific. And these might have been the most terrifying of all, because they felt personal. There was a widespread medieval superstition that if a bird flew into the palace, especially a dark bird like a crow or a raven, someone important was about to die. And if the bird died inside the palace, that was even worse. It meant death was already in the house, just waiting to reveal itself. Kings lived in constant low-level anxiety about birds. Palace servants were instructed to immediately report any bird sightings. Windows were kept covered. Guards were posted specifically to shoo away any flying creatures that approached the royal chambers. And when birds did get inside, the panic was real. In 1471, King Henry VI of England, the same king who lost his throne partly because of bad omens, was imprisoned in the Tower of London. He'd been overthrown. His mental illness had worsened. And now he was basically waiting to see if his captors would let him live or order his execution. One day, a raven flew into his cell. Now, the Tower of London already had a dark reputation. It was where people went to die. And ravens? Ravens were birds of death, creatures that fed on battlefields and gallows. Henry, according to accounts, saw the raven and simply said, "So it's time then." 3 days later, he was found dead. The official cause was given as melancholy. Basically, he died of sadness. But most historians believe he was murdered, probably smothered with a pillow. Did the raven predict his death? Or did someone planning to kill Henry happen to release a raven in his cell first, to make the murder seem like fulfilled prophecy? To make it seem like God's will, rather than political assassination? We don't know. But the raven story spread, and it became one more piece of evidence that Henry had lost God's favor, that his death was cosmically ordained. The wisdom in watching. These kinds of animal omens created a constant atmosphere of dread in medieval courts. Every unusual animal behavior became potentially significant. If a horse refused to be mounted by the king, that was a bad sign. If dogs howled at night near the palace, someone would die soon. If cats acted strangely, witchcraft was suspected. If chickens laid eggs with blood spots, disaster approached. You might think this is superstitious nonsense, but consider what it actually created. A heightened state of awareness. Medieval people noticed things. They paid attention to patterns in animal behavior, in weather, in health symptoms, in social dynamics. Yes, they often drew the wrong conclusions from their observations, but the practice of looking for signs made them genuinely more observant than we are in many ways. When was the last time you really paid attention to bird behavior? To changes in animal patterns? To subtle shifts in the natural world around you? We're so insulated from nature that we've lost that awareness entirely. Medieval people couldn't afford to. Their lives depended on reading their environment. And sometimes, just sometimes, those observations contain genuine wisdom wrapped in supernatural interpretation. There's a documented case from 1347, when ships arrived at the port of Genoa in Italy, carrying sailors who were sick with a mysterious illness. But before the ships even docked, witnesses reported that the rats aboard the ships were behaving strangely. Hundreds of them were pouring off the ships, swimming desperately toward shore as if fleeing something. The city officials saw this and interpreted it as an evil omen. They quarantined the ships, refusing to let anyone disembark. The people on board were suffering from bubonic plague, the Black Death. By quarantining those ships based on an omen of fleeing rats, Genoa probably saved itself from being the first city devastated by the plague. The rats weren't fleeing evil spirits. They were fleeing dying humans and seeking new hosts. But the superstitious interpretation led to the correct public health response. When fear creates monsters, not every omen interpretation was helpful, of course. Sometimes the search for supernatural meaning led to tragedy. In the 1450s, there was a series of unusually severe thunderstorms across northern Europe. Lightning strikes caused numerous fires. Several people were struck and killed by lightning, including a priest who was killed inside his own church, which was particularly disturbing because churches were supposed to be sacred sanctuary. Religious authorities interpreted these storms as signs of God's anger. But anger about what? What sin was so terrible that God was literally hurling lightning at his own churches? Some preachers decided the answer was obvious. Witchcraft. Witches were causing the storms. Witches were corrupting Christian society. The only solution was to root out the witches and burn them. And thus began one of the most horrific periods of witch persecution in European history, partially triggered by bad weather interpreted as supernatural omens. Thousands of people, mostly women, mostly those who were old or poor or socially marginalized, were accused, tortured, and executed. All because people couldn't accept that sometimes storms are just storms. That sometimes lightning strikes churches simply because churches tend to be the tallest buildings in town, with metal bells that attract lightning. The desperate need to find meaning in random events, to believe that nothing happens without supernatural purpose, created monsters out of ordinary people. That's the dark side of omen reading. It can create scapegoats. It can turn tragedy into persecution. It can make coincidence feel like conspiracy. Henry VIII and the stars. But even knowing this, even seeing the damage that excessive superstition caused, medieval rulers couldn't abandon omens entirely. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the omens revealed truths that rational analysis missed. And nowhere is this more dramatically illustrated than in the story of England's Henry VIII, a king who let astrologers whisper in his ear while he tore apart a kingdom, a church, and 6 different marriages, all because the stars told him he deserved a son. The astrological king. Henry VIII is remembered for many things. 6 wives, 2 of whom he had beheaded, breaking with the Catholic Church to create the Church of England. The magnificent portrait of him standing with his legs wide, dripping in jewels and furs, radiating power and menace. But here's what most people don't know. Henry was utterly obsessed with astrology. He didn't just consult astrologers occasionally for entertainment. He based major decisions, marriages, executions, military campaigns, religious policy, on what the stars supposedly told him. He employed multiple astrologers at court simultaneously, sometimes playing them against each other to get the interpretation he wanted. And when their predictions didn't come true, when reality refused to match what the heavens supposedly promised, well, being Henry's astrologer was one of the most dangerous jobs in Tudor England. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually looked like. The promise of a son. It's January 1533. Henry has been trying to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, for 6 years. 6 agonizing years of negotiations with the Pope, with the Catholic Church, with anyone who might give him permission to end his marriage. Why? Because Catherine hasn't given him a male heir. She's had multiple pregnancies, multiple miscarriages, and only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. Henry is desperate for a son. Desperate in a way that's hard for us to fully understand. This isn't just ego. This is politics. The last time England didn't have a clear male heir, the country tore itself apart in the Wars of the Roses. Henry genuinely believes that without a son, England will descend into civil war after his death. And he's fallen completely, obsessively in love with a woman named Anne Boleyn, who is conveniently younger and might be able to give him that son. But the Pope won't grant the divorce. Catherine refuses to quietly step aside. Henry is stuck. So Henry does something that will change English history forever. He consults his astrologers, and they tell him exactly what he wants to hear. The chief astrologer at this time was a man named Nicholas Kratzer, German, brilliant mathematician, genuinely skilled at astronomical calculations. Kratzer cast horoscopes for both Henry and Anne, and according to the charts he drew up, their union was blessed by the stars. Venus was in a favorable position. Jupiter promised fertility. The alignment of Mars suggested that their children would be strong, powerful, destined for greatness. Most importantly, Kratzer's charts predicted that Anne would give Henry a son. Not just any son. A son who would be a great warrior, a unifier, a king who would restore England to glory. Henry was ecstatic. Finally, confirmation that what he wanted was also what the cosmos wanted. Divine approval for his desires. He married Anne in secret in January 1533, before the divorce from Catherine was even finalized. He broke with the Catholic Church entirely, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England, just so he could legally marry Anne. He tore apart England's relationship with Catholic Europe. He dissolved monasteries. He executed anyone who opposed him, including his former advisor, Thomas More. All of this catastrophic upheaval, because the stars said Anne would give him a son. Anne got pregnant almost immediately. The astrologers were consulted constantly throughout her pregnancy. They cast chart after chart, tracking the movements of celestial bodies, calculating the exact moment of conception, predicting the nature of the child. Every single astrologer agreed this would be a boy, a healthy, strong male heir. Henry was so confident that he had official documents drawn up in advance, ready to be sent to foreign courts. The Queen has been delivered of a prince, they read. On September 7, 1533, Anne went into labor. Henry waited, probably pacing, certainly praying, definitely imagining his son, his heir, his dynasty secured at last. And Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Can you imagine that moment? The crushing disappointment, the rage, the humiliation of having told everyone, having told all of Europe that the stars promised a son. Henry tried to hide his reaction. The official celebrations went ahead, though in a muted form. But everyone knew. The astrologers had been wrong. The stars had lied. Or had they? When the stars turned dark, some astrologers immediately started backtracking. We must have miscalculated the exact moment of conception. The charts were off by a few degrees, which changes everything. Others blamed Anne herself, suggesting that she must have done something to anger the heavens, to corrupt the cosmic blessing. But the damage was done. Henry's faith in astrology didn't waver, but his faith in Anne began to crack. Anne got pregnant again, and again. The astrologers were consulted, and again they predicted a son, and again Anne miscarried, and then she miscarried again, and again. By 1536, Henry had convinced himself that his marriage to Anne was cursed. And guess what? The astrologers told him there'd been a bad omen all along that they'd somehow missed. Some claimed they'd seen warning signs they'd been afraid to mention. Others pointed to astronomical events around the time of their wedding that, in hindsight, suggested doom. There was supposedly a red star that appeared in the sky around the time Henry married Anne. Possibly Mars in an unusually bright phase, or just a story invented after the fact. Astrologers now claimed this red star had been a warning. Red meant blood, danger, disaster. The marriage was cosmically tainted from the beginning. Did that red star actually appear? Or did someone invent it to give Henry a supernatural justification for what he already wanted to do? Get rid of Anne? We'll probably never know. But what we do know is this. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested on charges of adultery, treason, and witchcraft. She was tried in a court where the verdict was predetermined. And on May 19, 1536, she was beheaded at the Tower of London. Before her execution, Anne supposedly said, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck." Then she laughed. Because what else can you do when you're about to be killed because the stars lied to your husband? The pattern repeats. Henry married Jane Seymour, wife number 3, just 11 days after Anne's execution. 11 days. He'd probably been planning it for months, waiting for the right astrological moment. And this is where it gets darkly funny. Henry consulted his astrologers about the best day to marry Jane. They calculated planetary positions, lunar phases, the positions of various stars. They determined that late May 1536 was an auspicious time for a new marriage that would produce male heirs. Jane got pregnant. The astrologers were consulted constantly. They predicted, you can probably guess, a son. And this time, they were right. On October 12, 1537, Jane gave birth to Edward, Henry's long-awaited male heir. Henry was overjoyed. The astrologers were vindicated. See? They'd been right all along. The earlier predictions hadn't been wrong. They'd just been about the wrong wife. But Jane died 12 days after giving birth, probably from postnatal complications or infection. And the astrologers? They claimed they'd seen warning signs of her death in the stars, but they'd been afraid to tell the king because he was so happy about finally having a son. Do you see the pattern? When predictions came true, the astrologers took credit. When predictions failed, there was always a reason: miscalculation, misinterpretation, or convenient omens that had been overlooked, but could now be pointed to in hindsight. And Henry kept believing. Through 3 more wives. Through years of paranoia, executions, religious upheaval, and political chaos. He never stopped consulting the stars, the unfalsifiable system. But it wasn't just about marriages. Henry used astrology to plan military campaigns, and the results were mixed. In 1544, Henry decided to invade France. He was 53 years old, massively overweight, suffering from painful ulcers on his legs, but still convinced he was destined to reclaim English territories in France. His astrologers drew up charts for the campaign. They calculated the most auspicious dates for crossing the Channel, for laying siege to French cities, for major battles. The campaign was a disaster. It cost enormous amounts of money, achieved almost nothing, and Henry had to be carried around on a litter because he could barely walk. But when he returned to England, did he blame the astrologers? Did he execute them for giving him bad advice? No, he blamed the French for not fighting fairly. He blamed his generals for not following the astrological timing precisely enough. He blamed everyone except the stars. That's the thing about astrology. It's unfalsifiable. There's always a way to explain why predictions didn't come true. That doesn't require abandoning belief in astrology itself. The stars don't lie, Henry's astrologers would say, but reading them is difficult. The smallest miscalculation can change everything. It's the perfect system for a king who wants to believe he's making divinely guided decisions, while actually just doing whatever he wanted anyway. The final irony: Henry died in January 1547 at age 55, not in his 80s or 90s as the astrologers had promised. He was morbidly obese, probably suffering from type 2 diabetes, with infected leg ulcers that never healed. His final years were marked by paranoia, pain, and rage. In his last days, did he ask his astrologers why the stars had been wrong about his longevity? Did he question whether any of it had been real? We don't know. The records don't tell us. But we do know that right up until the end, he kept astrologers at his bedside, asking them to calculate the most favorable times for taking medicine, for receiving visitors, for making his final confession. Even facing death, he was looking to the stars for guidance. And his son Edward, the son he'd destroyed so much to have, the male heir who was supposed to secure the Tudor dynasty, ruled for only 6 years before dying at age 15, probably of tuberculosis. The Tudor male line ended with him. All that destruction, all that upheaval, all those deaths, and the dynasty passed to women anyway. First to Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, then to Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter. The daughter Henry had been so disappointed by at birth became Elizabeth I, one of England's greatest monarchs. The stars hadn't known. The astrologers hadn't predicted. And all of Henry's desperate attempts to control his destiny through cosmic fortune-telling had achieved nothing he intended. There's a bitter irony in that. But there's also a kind of justice. Louis XIV and the wax figures. While Henry was obsessing over English horoscopes across the Channel in France, another monarch was developing an equally strange superstition. But Louis XIV's fear wasn't about stars or omens. It was about something much more specific, much more peculiar, and in some ways much more psychologically revealing. Louis IV, the Sun King, the most powerful monarch in Europe, the man who built Versailles and declared l'État, I am the state, lived in absolute terror of wax figures, of dolls, of tiny replicas of himself. And that fear would shape the court of Versailles in ways that are stranger than any fiction. The affair of the poisons. Louis XIV was perhaps the most powerful monarch in European history. He ruled France for 72 years, the longest reign of any major European monarch. He built Versailles, one of the most magnificent palaces ever constructed. He centralized absolute power in his own hands to a degree that previous kings had only dreamed of. He literally called himself the Sun King because he believed all of France should orbit around him. And this man, this embodiment of absolute confidence and power, was terrified of dolls. Specifically, he was terrified of wax figures, effigies, small replicas of himself made from wax or clay or wood. Because in 17th century France, there was a widespread belief that if someone created a figure of you and performed certain rituals on it, they could control you, curse you, kill you from a distance. This wasn't just superstition. This was witchcraft. And Louis XIV believed in it absolutely. Let me give you a sense of how serious this was. In the 1660s, when Louis was still a young king consolidating his power, there was a scandal involving his mistress, a woman named Louise de la Vallière. Louise fell out of favor and was replaced by a new mistress, Madame de Montespan. And Montespan wanted to make sure she stayed in the king's favor. So she hired a woman named Catherine Monvoisin, known as La Voisine, who was basically the most famous fortune teller and occultist in Paris. La Voisine promised Montespan that she could create love spells that would keep the king devoted to her forever. What did these love spells involve? According to the testimony that came out later during the trial, La Voisine and her associates created wax figures of the king. They performed what they called black masses over these figures, twisted versions of Catholic rituals involving sacrifices and incantations. They mixed potions containing various substances, some herbal, some far more disturbing. And for a while, Montespan remained the king's favorite. She bore him 7 children. She had enormous influence over court decisions. She seemed untouchable. But then, in 1679, the entire thing unraveled in what became known as the Affair of the Poisons. An investigation revealed that La Voisine and her network weren't just performing love spells. They were selling poisons to aristocratic women who wanted to murder inconvenient husbands. They were performing fake exorcisms. They were conducting ceremonies that involved infant sacrifice. Whether these sacrifices actually happened or were just lurid rumors is still debated by historians. But the accusations were made under torture and taken seriously at the time. When the investigation reached Madame de Montespan, when it was revealed that the king's own mistress had been involved with these occultists, Louis XIV personally shut down the investigation. He ordered all records sealed. Many witnesses were imprisoned for life without trial, essentially buried alive in fortress prisons to prevent them from talking about what they knew. Was Louis protecting Montespan, or was he protecting himself, preventing the world from knowing that someone had been performing magic rituals on wax figures of him? We'll never know the full truth because Louis made sure the evidence disappeared. The architecture of protection. But what we do know is that after this scandal, Louis became obsessed with preventing anyone from creating images of him without permission. All portraits of the king had to be officially approved. Sculptures required royal authorization. And wax figures, absolutely forbidden. If anyone was caught with a wax effigy of the king, it was treated as an act of treason, because the assumption was that if you had a wax figure of the king, you were planning to use it for witchcraft. This wasn't paranoia without precedent. Throughout medieval and early modern Europe, there were documented cases, or at least documented accusations, of people using effigies for harmful magic. In 1324 in Ireland, a woman named Alice Keiteler was accused of creating wax figures of her husband and neighbors to control and harm them. She was one of the first recorded victims of witchcraft persecution in Ireland. In 1441 in England, Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, was accused of trying to kill King Henry VI using wax effigies melted slowly over fire. The idea being that as the wax melted, the king would waste away and die. She was convicted and imprisoned for life. In 1563, Elizabeth I of England was reportedly terrified when a wax figure with a pin through its breast was found in Lincoln's Inn Fields in London. She ordered an immediate investigation into who had created it and why. So Louis's fear wasn't entirely irrational. This was a real practice, or at least a real accusation, that had destroyed lives and toppled powerful people. But Louis took his fear further than most rulers. He built it into the architecture of Versailles itself. Versailles wasn't just a palace. It was a machine designed to keep the king safe and in control. And part of that design involved making it nearly impossible for anyone to perform hostile magic against him. The palace was designed with Louis's bedroom at the exact center. Not just symbolically, literally, geometrically centered. All the major pathways of the palace radiated out from the king's chambers like rays of the sun. The idea was that Louis, as the Sun King, should be at the center of everything, with everything flowing toward and away from him. But this design also served a protective function, with the king at the center, surrounded by layers of rooms and corridors and guards and courtiers. It was nearly impossible for an enemy to get close enough to steal a personal item. A hair, a piece of clothing, bodily fluids that could be used to create a sympathetic magical link. Because that's how effigy magic supposedly worked. You needed something from the person's body to make the magic effective. Hair was best. Nail clippings, blood, saliva, even clothing that had absorbed sweat. Without that personal connection, the wax figure was just a doll. The rituals of safety. So Louis's daily routine was designed to prevent theft of personal items. His clothes were guarded before he wore them and after. His bedding was changed by trusted servants under supervision. His food preparation was monitored obsessively, partly to prevent poison, but also to prevent magical contamination. Even his chamber pot was closely guarded. Yes, really. Because in magical thinking, nothing was more personally connected to you than your bodily waste. If someone got access to that, well, they could theoretically work very powerful magic. It sounds absurd to modern ears. But to Louis and his court, this was serious business. This was life and death. And the fear wasn't just about death. It was about control. The idea that someone could use magic to control the king's mind, to influence his decisions, to puppet him from a distance. That was perhaps even more terrifying than assassination. Because how would you know if you're being magically influenced? Would you even realize it? Would your thoughts feel like your own? Or would you just make decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but were actually being guided by someone else's malicious intent? This is where superstition becomes genuinely paranoia-inducing, because it's unfalsifiable. Any mistake, any bad decision, any moment of confusion could potentially be evidence of magical interference. The more you believe in this kind of magic, the less you can trust your own mind. The prisoner of ritual. Louis dealt with this fear by constructing elaborate rituals that he believed would protect him. Every morning, he participated in a ceremony called the lever, the rising. Court officials would enter his bedchamber in strict order of rank, each with specific duties. The process of dressing the king was ceremonial, with each piece of clothing handled by different people according to protocol. This wasn't just royal pageantry. It was protective magic disguised as etiquette. By having multiple people involved in every aspect of his daily routine, Louis ensured that no single person had unsupervised access to his personal possessions. It was crowdsourced security through ritual. But Louis's superstitions went beyond fear of wax figures. He was deeply invested in lucky numbers, auspicious colors, and mystical symbolism. The number 14 was particularly important to him. He was Louis XIV. He believed this number was cosmically significant to his destiny. Many of the architectural features of Versailles incorporate multiples of 14. State ceremonies often involved 14 participants or 14 repetitions of certain actions. Was there any real power in this numerology? Of course not. But it gave Louis a sense of control, a feeling that he was aligned with cosmic patterns. And for a king who had survived a civil war in his childhood, the Fronde Rebellion, which traumatized young Louis and shaped his entire approach to kingship, any sense of control was precious. See, Louis hadn't always been the all-powerful Sun King. When he was a child, he'd experienced real powerlessness. During the Fronde, aristocratic rebels had actually broken into the royal palace, had stood over his bed while he pretended to sleep, checking that the royal family was still in Paris and not fleeing. That violation, that moment of absolute vulnerability, never left him. Versailles, with all its elaborate rituals and protective superstitions, was Louis's response to that childhood trauma. He created a world where he was always in control, always protected, always at the center, always safe. But safety came at a cost. The rituals became suffocating. Court life at Versailles was incredibly rigid, with every action prescribed, every moment choreographed. Nobles competed for the privilege of handing the king his shirt or holding his candle, not because these were meaningful activities, but because proximity to the king meant power. And Louis, at the center of this elaborate machine, became increasingly isolated. How do you have genuine relationships when every interaction is ritualized? How do you trust anyone when you believe people might be using magic against you? There's a poignant story from later in Louis' life that illustrates this isolation. In his 70s, after most of his family had died, his son, multiple grandchildren, even great-grandchildren, struck down by disease, Louis was essentially alone. He'd outlived almost everyone he loved. One evening, he supposedly said to one of his few remaining confidants, "I've built the greatest palace in the world, and I'm more alone in it than a hermit in the desert." The superstitions that were meant to protect him had also imprisoned him. The final irony. For all his protective rituals, for all his fear of wax figures and magical assassination, Louis XIV died of gangrene, a completely natural medical cause. His leg developed an infection that spread despite the best efforts of his physicians, who were still using medieval medical practices, like bloodletting that probably made things worse. As he lay dying in August 1715, did Louis wonder if someone had cursed him after all? Did he think about all the wax figures he'd ordered destroyed, all the suspected witches he'd imprisoned, all the elaborate rituals that had failed to protect him from a simple infection? We don't know. But we do know that even on his deathbed, he maintained the ceremonial protocols. The lever and coucher, the rising and lying down ceremonies, continued until he physically couldn't participate anymore. The rituals that were meant to protect him became the rituals that accompanied his death. Louis XIV had built a world where he was the sun, and everything revolved around him. But when he died, that world didn't collapse. It just continued without him. Versailles kept functioning. The rituals continued with a new king. The sun had set. But France kept turning. Maybe that was the greatest superstition of all, the belief that he was irreplaceable, that his divine right, his cosmic significance, his protected status made him essential to the world's functioning. But the universe doesn't actually care about kings. And no amount of protective magic changes that fundamental truth. Rasputin and the Romanovs. While Louis was building his ritual fortress in France, there was a royal family across Europe that would take superstition to an even more dangerous extreme. A family that would invite a wandering mystic into their inner circle, would trust him with their dynasty's most precious secret, would believe his claims of healing power and prophetic vision so completely that they'd let him influence major political decisions. And that misplaced faith in one man's supposed supernatural gifts would contribute to the destruction of a 300-year-old dynasty and help trigger one of the most violent revolutions in human history. The Romanovs of Russia were about to make a fatal mistake, and his name was Rasputin. A mother's desperation. Imagine you're the Empress of Russia. Your husband rules over 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. Your family has held absolute power for 3 centuries. You live in palaces so opulent, they make Versailles look modest. You have everything anyone could possibly want, except the one thing that matters most to you: a healthy son. You've had 4 daughters, beautiful, intelligent, beloved daughters. But in Imperial Russia, daughters can't inherit the throne. You need a son. The dynasty needs an heir. And after years of praying, after countless miscarriages and disappointments, you finally have him. Alexei, born August 12, 1904. The Tsarevich, the future Tsar of Russia. And he has hemophilia, a genetic bleeding disorder with no cure. Any injury, even a minor bump or bruise, could cause internal bleeding that might kill him. You watch your son suffer through agonizing episodes where his joints swell with blood, where he screams in pain for hours, where the best doctors in the empire can do nothing but watch helplessly. What would you do? How far would you go to save him? This is the situation Alexandra Feodorovna, Empress of Russia, found herself in, and her desperate love for her son would lead her to place her faith in a man who would help destroy everything her family had built. His name was Grigory Rasputin, and he is one of the most misunderstood figures in history, painted as either a demonic mystic who hypnotized the royal family or a misunderstood holy man who was actually trying to help. The truth, as always, is more complicated and more human. The wandering holy man. Let me tell you who Rasputin actually was before he arrived at the imperial court, because his background explains a lot about why Alexandra believed in him so completely. Rasputin was born in 1869 in a small Siberian village called Pokrovskoye. His family were peasants, poor, illiterate, working the land in one of the harshest climates on earth. Rasputin himself had almost no formal education, but he was, by all accounts, genuinely charismatic. He had a presence that people noticed. In his 20s, Rasputin had what he described as a religious awakening. He left his family and spent years wandering Russia as a strannik, a holy wanderer. These weren't monks or priests. They were lay people who rejected normal life to seek spiritual truth through pilgrimage and prayer. In Russian Orthodox tradition, Straniki were respected, considered to have a direct connection to God precisely because they had rejected worldly comfort. Rasputin gained a reputation as a healer and prophet. He would arrive in villages, pray with people, give spiritual advice, and occasionally, people claimed he healed their illnesses. Was it genuine spiritual power? Psychological suggestion? Natural recovery that happened to coincide with his presence? We'll never know. But the reputation grew. By 1905, Rasputin had made his way to St. Petersburg, Russia's capital. And through a series of connections, friends of friends, aristocrats interested in mysticism, clergy impressed by his apparent devotion, he was introduced to the imperial family. The first time Rasputin met Nicholas and Alexandra, young Alexei wasn't having a crisis. The meeting was more of a curiosity. This strange holy man from Siberia who supposedly had healing powers. But the Empress was desperate enough to meet with anyone who might help her son. She had already consulted doctors, specialists, priests, and various mystics. Most had been useless. Some had made things worse. Rasputin was different. He didn't offer complex treatments or medical theories. He just looked at the family with his intense, penetrating eyes. Multiple accounts mention his eyes, describing them as hypnotic, impossible to look away from, and said simply, "The boy will live. God has told me." And for a while, nothing happened. Rasputin would visit occasionally, pray with the family, and leave. He wasn't a constant presence. Not yet. The miracle. Then came the crisis that changed everything. October 1912. The imperial family was staying at their hunting lodge in Poland. 8-year-old Alexei was playing and somehow bumped his leg. Accounts differ on exactly what happened, but it was a minor incident. Except for a hemophiliac, there are no minor injuries. The bump caused internal bleeding in his upper thigh and groin. The blood pooled under the skin, creating an enormous, agonizing hematoma. Alexei's screams could be heard throughout the lodge. The doctors couldn't stop the bleeding. They gave him what pain medication they had, Morphine, probably. But it wasn't enough. For 11 days, Alexei was dying. The doctors told Nicholas and Alexandra to prepare for the worst. Prayers were said. The family gathered. They were watching their son slowly bleed to death internally, and there was nothing medical science could do. Alexandra, in desperation, sent a telegram to Rasputin, who was back in Siberia. "Come quickly. Alexei is dying." Rasputin didn't come. Instead, he sent a telegram back. It said simply, "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." And within hours of receiving that telegram, Alexei's bleeding stopped. The crisis passed. The boy began to recover. Now, here's where we need to pause and really think about what might have happened. Because this event, this seemingly miraculous recovery, convinced Alexandra that Rasputin had supernatural healing powers, and that belief would shape the next 5 years of Russian history. What actually happened? We don't know for certain, but there are several medical theories. 1. The doctors had been constantly examining Alexei, moving him, trying various treatments. Aspirin had recently been discovered and was being used widely, and aspirin thins the blood, which would make hemophilia worse. If Rasputin's telegram led the Empress to order the doctors to leave Alexei alone, to stop administering medications, that cessation might have allowed the boy's body to finally begin clotting naturally. 2. Rasputin might have had genuine insight into the psychological component of pain. Hemophilia isn't just about bleeding. Stress and anxiety can actually make episodes worse by raising blood pressure and heart rate. Rasputin's calm, confident presence and reassuring words might have genuinely helped Alexei relax, which would have helped his body stabilize. 3. The timing might have been pure coincidence. Hemophilia episodes, even severe ones, eventually resolve as the body forms clots. The crisis might have been near its natural end when Rasputin's telegram arrived, and Alexandra associated the two events causally when they were merely correlated. But whatever the medical reality, the psychological impact was absolute. From Alexandra's perspective, Rasputin had saved her son from across 1,000 miles of distance with nothing but a prayer and a telegram. That was miracle enough to earn eternal devotion. The holy man's power? From that point on, Rasputin became indispensable to the imperial family. Anytime Alexei had a bleeding episode, and there were many, Alexandra would summon Rasputin. And remarkably, consistently, Rasputin's presence seemed to help. Sometimes the boy would calm down. Sometimes the bleeding would slow. Sometimes the crisis would pass more quickly than the doctors expected. Was this supernatural? Or was it that Rasputin's calm confidence reduced the family's panic, which reduced Alexei's stress, which genuinely helped his condition stabilize? Does it matter? To Alexandra, Rasputin was a gift from God, a saint, the only person who could save her son. And that belief gave Rasputin enormous power. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because Rasputin wasn't just a healer. He was also deeply flawed in very human ways. He drank heavily. He was accused of sexual impropriety with multiple women. Some accusations were probably true, others were likely exaggerated by his enemies. He was crude, often drunk, and when he was in public, he behaved in ways that shocked polite society. Imagine the most powerful woman in Russia treating a drunken peasant as her most trusted advisor. Imagine that peasant sitting in the palace, offering opinions on everything from military strategy to government appointments to foreign policy. Imagine Nicholas II, Emperor of all the Russias, asking this barely literate holy man for advice on whether to go to war. This is what happened. And Russian society, especially the aristocracy and the church, was horrified. Rasputin became the most hated man in Russia. Newspapers published scandalous stories about him, many exaggerated or completely fabricated. Political cartoons depicted him as a demon or a puppet master, controlling the royal family. Aristocrats whispered that he'd hypnotized the empress, that he was her lover, that he'd bewitched the entire family. None of the sexual scandal allegations involving Alexandra were true. Multiple investigations found no evidence, but the rumors persisted because people couldn't understand why else the empress would trust this inappropriate peasant over educated advisors and experienced politicians. The real reason was simpler and sadder. He helped her son. Nothing else mattered to her. And Nicholas loved his wife too much to deny her this one source of hope. But Rasputin's influence extended beyond just healing Alexei. Alexandra genuinely believed Rasputin was a prophet who could see the future and understand God's will. When World War I began in 1914, Rasputin advised against it. "This war will be the end of Russia," he supposedly said. "The end of your family." He was right, though whether through genuine prophecy or just common sense is debatable. Russia was already unstable. A major war could easily trigger revolution. When Nicholas ignored this advice and committed Russia to the war, Rasputin's predictions began to take on an ominous quality. Because the war went badly, very badly. Millions of Russian soldiers died. The economy collapsed. Food shortages hit the cities. Political unrest grew. And where was the Tsar during all this? At military headquarters, trying to personally command the war effort, despite having no military training, which meant Alexandra was left in charge of the government in St. Petersburg. And who was advising her? Rasputin. When superstition becomes policy, this is where superstition became political disaster. Alexandra would consult Rasputin on government appointments. She'd ask his opinion on policy. And Rasputin, who had no political experience or understanding of governance, would give advice based on his intuitions, his personal biases, and sometimes just his mood. Ministers who opposed Rasputin would be dismissed. Competent officials were replaced with Rasputin's cronies. The government became dysfunctional. And all the while, Russia was losing the war, people were starving, and the Tsar seemed oblivious. By 1916, even people loyal to the monarchy were desperate to save it from Rasputin's influence. They believed, probably correctly, that as long as Rasputin controlled the empress and then the empress influenced the Tsar, the dynasty was doomed. So they decided to kill him. The unkillable man. The assassination of Rasputin is one of the most famous murder stories in history, though much of it has been exaggerated over time. Here's what we actually know. On December 29, 1916, a group of conspirators led by Prince Felix Yusupov, one of Russia's wealthiest aristocrats, invited Rasputin to Yusupov's palace under the pretense of meeting Yusupov's wife. They fed him cakes and wine that had been laced with cyanide. Enough cyanide, supposedly, to kill several men. Rasputin ate and drank, and nothing happened. He didn't get sick, didn't die, just kept eating and talking normally. The conspirators panicked. How was he surviving poison that should have killed him instantly? Was he actually supernatural, protected by dark magic? Finally, in desperation, Yusupov shot Rasputin in the chest. He fell. They checked his pulse. He seemed dead. They left the room to discuss what to do with the body. And then Rasputin stood up. According to Yusupov's later testimony, Rasputin grabbed him by the throat and tried to strangle him. Rasputin then stumbled out into the courtyard, still alive despite the gunshot. The conspirators shot him again, multiple times. He finally fell in the snow. They wrapped his body and threw it into the Neva River through a hole in the ice. When the body was recovered days later, the autopsy suggested that Rasputin was still alive when he hit the water, that he drowned, that he'd survived the poison, survived multiple gunshots, and only died by drowning. This story has been told and retold, becoming more dramatic each time. Modern historians doubt many of the details. The cyanide probably wasn't as concentrated as claimed. It degrades over time and might have been old. Rasputin's apparent resurrection might have been a dying convulsion rather than genuine consciousness. The autopsy reports have been disputed, but true or exaggerated, the story spread. and it reinforced Rasputin's legendary status, the holy man who couldn't be killed, who survived poison and bullets, who seemed to have supernatural protection, except the protection ended in ice-cold water on a winter night in St. Petersburg. And here's the truly tragic part. Killing Rasputin didn't save the monarchy. It was too late. The damage was done. Just 2 months after Rasputin's death, in March 1917, revolution broke out in St. Petersburg. Nicholas II was forced to abdicate. The 300-year-old Romanov dynasty ended. And 16 months after that, in July 1918, the entire imperial family, Nicholas Alexandra, their 4 daughters, and all executed by Bolsheviks in a basement in Ekaterinburg. Rasputin had predicted it. If I die or you desert me, you will lose your son and your crown within 6 months. He was off by a few months, but essentially correct. So was Rasputin a holy man? A charlatan? A healer? A political disaster? He was probably all of these things simultaneously. He likely did have some genuine ability to calm Alexei through psychological means. He also absolutely exploited his position for personal gain and political influence he wasn't qualified to wield. He was a complicated, flawed human being who got caught up in historical forces far beyond his understanding or control. But the real tragedy isn't Rasputin. It's Alexandra, a mother so desperate to save her child that she couldn't see how her faith in one man was destroying everything else. A woman who believed so completely in divine intervention that she couldn't recognize political reality. That's the danger of superstition at the highest levels of power. It's not that belief in the supernatural is inherently wrong. It's that it can make you vulnerable to manipulation. It can blind you to practical realities. It can lead you to trust the wrong people for the wrong reasons. And when you're making decisions that affect millions of people, that blind faith can have catastrophic consequences. The Romanovs weren't the only royal family whose supernatural beliefs would shape history. Across Asia, emperors and kings had their own relationship with the mystical. But their superstitions took different forms, reflected different cultural values, and led to different kinds of challenges. Like the king who believed that cameras could literally steal his soul and tried to ban photography from his entire kingdom. Or the emperor who consulted turtle shells before every major decision, believing that the cracks formed in heated bone could reveal the will of heaven. The camera and the soul. The year's 1866. King Mongkut of Siam, what we now call Thailand, is dying. He's one of the most progressive monarchs in Southeast Asian history. He's modernized his kingdom, opened it to Western trade, reformed the legal system, and personally studied Western science and astronomy. He speaks English fluently. He's corresponded with Abraham Lincoln. He's hired European tutors for his children. This is a man of reason, of education, of enlightenment. And yet, throughout his entire reign, he's refused to be photographed in certain ways. He's terrified that the camera might capture his soul. This isn't ignorance. Mongkut understands how cameras work mechanically. He knows about optics, about light and chemical reactions on plates. He's read Western scientific texts, but somewhere deep in his belief system, shaped by Thai Buddhist and animist traditions, there's a fear that photographs are different from paintings or sculptures, that they capture something essential, something that shouldn't be captured. And he's not alone. Throughout Asia, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, royal families grappled with a unique challenge. How do you maintain ancient spiritual beliefs while adopting modern technology? How do you honor traditions that say the emperor is divine while also building railroads and telegraphs? How do you preserve superstitions that have protected your dynasty for centuries while also engaging with a rapidly changing world? The answers were fascinating, contradictory, and sometimes tragic. King Chulalongkorn's compromise. Mongkut's successor, his son King Chulalongkorn, known as Ramavi, ruled Siam from 1868 to 1910, and he faced this tension even more intensely than his father. Ramavi wanted to modernize Siam. He'd seen what happened to countries that resisted Western influence. They got colonized. Burma, Vietnam, Cambodia, all had fallen under European control. Siam remained independent, largely because Rama V was brilliant at diplomatic maneuvering and selective modernization. But modernization meant accepting Western customs, including photography. The first time Rama V sat for a photograph, it was a major spiritual crisis. Court Brahmin priests, yes. Thailand's Buddhist kings also employed Hindu Brahmins for certain ceremonies, were deeply concerned. They performed elaborate rituals before and after the photography session. Incense was burned. Prayers were chanted. Protective amulets were placed around the camera. Because in traditional Thai belief, your image isn't just a representation of you. It contains a piece of your essence, your Kwan, a spiritual essence that makes you alive, that keeps your body and soul connected. If someone captures your image, especially through the magical Western process of photography, they might capture part of your Kwan. And if they have part of your Kwan, they might be able to control you, curse you, or drain your life force. This belief wasn't unique to Thailand. Variations of it existed across Asia, Africa, Native American cultures, basically any culture that encountered photography before fully understanding it scientifically. But here's what's interesting. Rama V didn't just dismiss these fears. He took them seriously while also recognizing the practical necessity of photography for international relations. Foreign dignitaries expected to exchange photographs. Modern governance required documentation. So he developed a compromise. Official photographs would only be taken after appropriate spiritual preparations. The king would wear specific protective amulets. Certain angles were forbidden. You couldn't photograph him in ways that might symbolically diminish his status. The photographs would be blessed after development, and copies would be carefully controlled. You couldn't just have random people possessing images of the king. Over time, as nothing bad happened, as the king remained healthy despite being photographed hundreds of times, the fears gradually eased. But they never completely disappeared. Even today, there are specific protocols around images of the Thai royal family. You can't just do anything with a royal portrait. There are laws, traditions, superstitions that persist. This gradual adaptation, maintaining core superstitions while selectively adopting modernity, was the pattern across Asian monarchies. But each culture had its own unique beliefs that shaped how rulers made decisions. The emperor and the turtle shells. Let's travel east to Japan, to the Meiji Emperor, who ruled from 1867 to 1912 and oversaw Japan's transformation from a feudal society to a modern industrial power. Emperor Meiji, whose personal name was Mutsuhito, faced an interesting challenge. In Japanese tradition, the emperor was considered a living god, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. How do you maintain that divine status while also building factories and railroads and Western-style armies? The answer involved very carefully managed symbolism and maintained superstitious practices behind the scenes. One practice that continued throughout the Meiji era was turtle shell divination, or plastromancy. This is an ancient form of divination that dates back thousands of years in East Asia. You take a turtle shell or animal bone, usually from a turtle or ox, and apply heat to it. The shell cracks in specific patterns. Trained diviners read these cracks to determine whether the gods favor a particular course of action. This sounds primitive, right? Except that Japan in the 1890s was building modern battleships and defeating Western powers in warfare. And the emperor was still consulting turtle shells before major decisions. But here's the nuance. These divinations weren't the only factor in decision-making. They were performed alongside modern strategic analysis, economic calculations, and military intelligence. The turtle shells provided spiritual confirmation for decisions that were already being made on practical grounds. It's similar to how American presidents often end speeches with "God bless America." It's not that they're basing policy on divine intervention, but they're acknowledging a spiritual dimension that matters to their culture. The difference is that in Meiji Japan, These practices were kept more hidden from Western observers. When foreign diplomats visited, they saw modernization, Western-style government buildings, European fashion. But in the inner sanctums of the imperial palace, ancient rituals continued. There's a fascinating account from a British diplomat in the 1870s who was confused because major Japanese government decisions seemed to be delayed for no apparent reason. Negotiations would be going smoothly, and then suddenly the Japanese side would ask for a week's postponement. Years later, he learned that these delays coincided with the need to perform divination rituals at auspicious times according to the lunar calendar. The Japanese government was literally scheduling modern diplomatic negotiations around ancient spiritual requirements. And you know what? It worked. Japan remained independent, modernized successfully, and became a major world power. Maybe the turtle shells were genuinely providing divine guidance, or maybe having a systematic pause for reflection before major decisions, even if justified by superstition, led to better outcomes than rushing into things. The wisdom of balance. This balancing act between ancient supernatural beliefs and modern practical needs is ultimately what allowed several Asian monarchies to survive longer than many European ones. They adapted, they compromised, they found ways to honor superstition symbolically while making practical decisions strategically. But not all superstitions could be balanced away. Some were so deeply embedded in royal culture, so fundamental to how power was justified and maintained, that they persisted regardless of practical cost. And nowhere was this more dramatically illustrated than in the elaborate rituals that royal families used to ward off evil, to protect themselves from spiritual threats, to ensure divine blessing. Rituals that were sometimes beautiful, sometimes disturbing, and always revealing of the deep human fear that no amount of earthly power can fully protect you from the unknown. Rituals of protection. There's a ritual that happens at the Tower of London every time a British monarch dies. Within hours of the death, a man in a dark suit approaches the ancient stone tower where 6 large ravens live. He carries black ribbons and speaks in a hushed voice. He ties the ribbons into small bows and attaches them to each raven's enclosure. Then he leans close and whispers to the birds, "The queen is dead. You have a new master now, the king. Serve him well." This happened in September 2022, when Queen Elizabeth II died. A raven master named Chris Scaife performed this ceremony, just as it's been performed for centuries. And if you think this sounds like a fairy tale, like something from a fantasy novel, I need to tell you, this is real. This happens in the 21st century, in one of the world's most modern nations. And there's a reason for it. A superstition so old and so deeply embedded that even now, nobody wants to risk breaking it. The superstition says, if the ravens ever leave the Tower of London, the kingdom will fall. The monarchy will crumble. Britain itself will collapse. So the ravens' wings are clipped. Not cruelly. They can still fly short distances and live healthy lives, but they can't leave. There are always at least 6 ravens at the tower, plus spares. They have names, individual personalities, dedicated caretakers. One raven named Merlina went missing in 2021, and it made national news. People were genuinely worried about what it might mean for the country's fate. Where did this superstition come from? The most popular story traces it back to King Charles II in the 1660s. Charles was interested in astronomy and wanted to build an observatory at the tower. But ravens kept gathering around, and their presence interfered with the astronomical observations. Charles ordered the ravens removed. But his court astronomer, John Flamsteed, or perhaps one of Charles's advisors, accounts vary, warned him about the old legend: remove the ravens and the kingdom falls. Charles, who'd already lived through the English Civil War, his father's execution, years of exile, and the Great Plague, wasn't about to take any chances with supernatural warnings. He decreed that at least 6 ravens must always remain at the tower. The observatory would be moved to Greenwich instead. And that decree has been honored ever since. Through wars, revolutions, the fall of the British Empire, the death of dozens of monarchs, the ravens remain. Because what if the legend is true? What if removing them really would cause catastrophe? Can you afford to test it? This is the essence of protective rituals. They persist because nobody wants to be the person who stopped doing them, and then something terrible happened. The pattern of protection. But the tower ravens are just one example. Royal families throughout history have performed far stranger, darker, and more elaborate rituals to protect themselves from supernatural threats. In medieval Europe, there was a practice called foundation sacrifices. The belief was simple. When you build something important, a palace, a fortress, a city wall, you need to appease the spirits of the land. You need to give something valuable to ensure the structure's protection. And what's more valuable than life itself? In ancient times, this sometimes meant actual human sacrifice. A person, often a slave, prisoner, or even a volunteer, would be killed and buried in the foundations of a new building. Their spirit would become a guardian, forever bound to protect the structure. We have archaeological evidence of this from around the world. In ancient China, foundation sacrifices have been found in Shang dynasty sites from 3,500 years ago. In Europe, there are medieval legends about people being walled up alive in castle foundations. By the medieval period, most European cultures had moved away from human sacrifice. Christianity explicitly forbade it. But the superstition didn't disappear. It evolved. Instead of humans, they'd sacrifice animals, often horses, which were valuable enough to be meaningful offerings. There are records from medieval European castles of horses being ritually killed and buried beneath cornerstones during construction. But sometimes they'd bury symbolic substitutes. In German and Scandinavian traditions, they'd bury bottles containing hair, nail clippings, and sometimes blood from the royal family. The idea was that these items contained the family's essence, and burying them in the foundations would bind the building to the dynasty's protection. The royal touch. Not all protective rituals were about buildings. Some were about the royal body itself. In medieval Europe, there was a practice called royal touch, the belief that a king's touch could cure certain diseases, particularly scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that caused swollen lymph nodes in the neck. It was actually called the king's evil because it was believed only a king could cure it. This wasn't just folklore. It was official policy. Kings of England and France regularly held ceremonies where sick people would line up, and the monarch would touch them one by one while saying a blessing. King Louis XIV of France, yes, our friend who was afraid of wax figures, touched thousands of sick people during his reign. There are records of ceremonies where hundreds of people would be touched in a single day. And some of them probably did get better, either because they would have recovered naturally anyway, or because the psychological boost of the king's touch helped their immune systems, or because they'd been misdiagnosed in the first place. But the ritual persisted because occasionally it seemed to work. And when you're desperate, when your child is sick and doctors are useless, why not try the king's touch? What do you have to lose? The practice continued in England until 1714, and in France until the Revolution dawned. The last English monarch to perform it was Queen Anne. After her, the Hanoverian kings who followed refused to continue the practice. They were German. They thought it was superstitious nonsense, and they weren't going to pretend they had magical healing powers. And you know what? The kingdom didn't fall. People kept getting scrofula, but they also kept recovering at the same rate they always had. It turned out the royal touch wasn't actually necessary. But some protective rituals have survived to the present day precisely because nobody's willing to test what happens if they stop. The eternal questions. So here we are, at the end of our journey through centuries of royal superstitions. We've watched pharaohs tremble at curses, seen Alexander refuse to fight without consulting bird omens, witnessed Chinese empresses manufacturing divine signs, walked through medieval courts paralyzed by fear of comets, watched Henry VIII destroy a kingdom chasing astrological promises, seen Louis XIV terrified of wax dolls. witnessed the Romanovs place their faith in a Siberian mystic, and explored Asian monarchies, navigating between ancient beliefs and modern realities. And through all of it, one question keeps returning. Why? Why did the most powerful people on Earth live in such fear? Why did absolute rulers, people who could execute anyone who opposed them, who commanded armies and controlled nations, consult birds, stars, prophets, and turtle shells before making decisions? The weight we all carry. The simple answer is because they were human, and humans are afraid. But let me give you the deeper answer. The answer that explains not just royal superstitions, but something fundamental about what it means to be human. Power doesn't eliminate uncertainty. In fact, it amplifies it. Think about it. If you make a bad decision in your own life, you suffer the consequences. Maybe you lose money, waste time, hurt a relationship. It's painful, but it's contained. The damage is limited. But if you're a king, if you make a bad decision, thousands of people die. Economies collapse. Dynasties fall. Nations are conquered. Your mistakes echo through history for centuries. That weight, that crushing, suffocating weight of responsibility would drive anyone to look for guidance beyond their own limited human judgment. And when you can't find certainty through rational means, because the future is genuinely unpredictable, because information is incomplete, because even the wisest advisors disagree, you start looking for certainty from supernatural sources. Because at least then you're not alone in the decision. At least then the gods, the stars, the omens, fate itself is sharing the burden. This is what we've been watching throughout this entire story. Not stupidity, not ignorance, but the desperate human need for reassurance when facing impossible choices. Alexander the Great consulting Aristander before every battle wasn't weakness. It was a coping mechanism for a young man carrying the weight of an empire on his shoulders. Wasn't just political manipulation, though it was that too. It was also a woman in a system designed to reject her, creating divine justification for her right to exist in power. Henry VIII obsessing over astrological predictions for sons wasn't mere superstition. It was a king terrified that his dynasty would end, that England would descend back into civil war, that everything his father built would crumble. Alexandra Romanov, trusting Rasputin wasn't blind faith. It was a mother watching her child suffer from an incurable disease, grasping at anything that might save him. These weren't foolish people. They were frightened people. And fear makes us all look for meaning, for patterns, for signs that someone, somewhere, has a plan. But we've also seen how superstition can be dangerous, how it can be manipulated, how it can blind rulers to practical realities and lead to catastrophic decisions. When Chinese emperors watched for celestial omens instead of addressing corruption and military weakness, their dynasties fell. When Korean royalty consulted shamans instead of responding strategically to Japanese aggression, they lost their independence. When Russian rulers trusted Rasputin's intuitions over experienced advisors, they helped trigger a revolution. So superstition is both comfort and trap, both coping mechanism and vulnerability, both ancient wisdom about pausing before decisions and a dangerous replacement for rational analysis. And this tension, this impossible balance, is still with us today. We like to think we're past all this. We're modern, scientific, rational. We don't believe in bird omens or turtle shell divination or wax figure curses. But do we really not? How many world leaders have personal astrologers? More than you'd think. Ronald Reagan famously consulted an astrologer named Joan Quigley, who helped schedule major presidential events based on astrological readings. This wasn't ancient history. This was the 1980s during the Cold War, when decisions affected nuclear arsenals. How many CEOs believe in lucky numbers? Consult feng shui masters before building headquarters? Won't launch products on the 13th? How many investors watch for signs and trade on intuition rather than pure data? How many military leaders have personal rituals they perform before making battle plans? The specifics have changed. We call it following your gut instead of reading omens. We call it manifestation instead of sympathetic magic. We call it energy instead of spirits. But the underlying impulse, the need to believe that the universe is giving us signs, that we're not alone in our decision-making, that there's meaning and pattern to the chaos, that hasn't changed at all. And maybe that's not entirely bad. Because here's something I've realized while researching this story. Superstition, for all its problems, forces you to slow down. It creates structured moments of reflection. It builds in pauses before major decisions. When Roman generals had to consult augurs before battles, it meant they couldn't attack impulsively. They had to wait. They had to think. They had to create space between impulse and action. Sometimes that delay led to better strategy. When Chinese emperors watched for celestial warnings, it created a culture where the ruler's legitimacy depended on good governance. If famines or disasters occurred, the emperor had to take responsibility and make changes. The mandate of heaven wasn't just superstition. It was a philosophical framework that made rulers accountable, at least in theory, to cosmic justice. When medieval European kings had elaborate coronation rituals involving anointing with holy oil and swearing oaths before God, it wasn't just pageantry. It was creating a psychological framework where even absolute monarchs believed they were answerable to something beyond themselves. These superstitions created moral constraints on power. They reminded rulers that they weren't gods themselves, that they were servants of something larger, that authority came with cosmic responsibilities. Without some form of this, whether religious, philosophical, or yes, superstitious, you get pure tyranny. Leaders who believe they're accountable to nothing and no one, who recognize no limits on their power, who make decisions based purely on personal whim. So maybe the question isn't whether royal superstitions were true or false. Maybe the question is, what did they prevent? What disasters didn't happen because a ruler paused to consult omens before acting? What tyrannies were restrained by belief in divine judgment? We'll never know. We can only measure what happened, not what was avoided. But I think there's a reason these superstitions persisted for so long, across so many different cultures, in so many different forms. They served a purpose, not the purpose people thought, not literal communication with gods or genuine prediction of the future, but a psychological and social purpose that was genuinely valuable. They made power bearable. They made impossible decisions possible. They created meaning in chaos and structure in uncertainty. And when we judge our ancestors for their superstitions, when we look back and laugh at kings afraid of comets or emperors consulting turtle shells, we're missing something important. We're missing that they were doing the best they could with the knowledge they had, that they were facing fears we still face, that they were looking for the same things we look for: certainty in uncertainty, meaning in chaos, reassurance that we're making the right choice. The tools have changed. The specifics have changed. But the fundamental human condition, the weight of decision-making, the fear of consequence, the desperate hope that someone or something can guide us, that's eternal. And maybe that's the real lesson of royal superstitions. Not that our ancestors were foolish, but that we're all still struggling with the same questions they struggled with. How do you make decisions when you don't have enough information? How do you trust yourself when the stakes are impossibly high? How do you live with the weight of power? How do you find meaning in a universe that doesn't seem to care about human hopes and fears? Kings and emperors couldn't answer these questions. They could only create rituals and superstitions and systems of meaning that made the questions bearable. And honestly, we're doing the same thing, just with different language. The connection. When you knock on wood, you're performing a protective ritual, just like Louis XIV performing ceremonies to ward off curses. When you have a lucky shirt you wear to important events, you're creating personal magic, just like Alexander consulting bird omens before battle. When you look for signs about whether a relationship is right or a job is meant to be, you're reading omens, just like Chinese emperors watching for celestial approval. We are them. They are us. separated by time and technology, but united by the fundamental experience of being human in an uncertain world. And there's something beautiful in recognizing that. Something humbling. Something that makes me feel more connected to these ancient rulers, rather than superior to them. Because the Tower of London still keeps its ravens. Thailand still performs its plowing ceremony. Japan still maintains elaborate imperial rituals. These aren't museum pieces. These aren't dead traditions. They're living connections to thousands of years of human beings, trying to make sense of existence. And when Queen Elizabeth died in 2022, and that Raven Master whispered to the ravens that they had a new master, he wasn't being foolish or backwards. He was participating in a ritual that connects the present to the past, that acknowledges mystery and meaning beyond pure rationality. That says, we don't know if this matters, but we're not willing to risk finding out. Maybe that's wisdom. Maybe that's superstition. Maybe there's no real difference. The final truth. What I know is this. Every human civilization has created these systems. Every culture has developed ways of reading the universe for signs. Every generation has looked to something beyond themselves for guidance. And the ones who claim they don't, who insist they're purely rational, purely logical, purely free from superstition, they're often the most superstitious of all. They've just hidden it better, disguised it in modern language, convinced themselves that their particular form of meaning-making is different from all the ancient ones. But it's not. We're old descendants of Alexander watching eagles, of Chinese empresses reading celestial signs, of medieval kings consulting oracles. We've inherited their fear and their hope and their desperate need to believe that the universe is trying to tell us something. And you know what? Maybe it is. Not through literal magic or supernatural intervention, but through the patterns we notice, the intuitions we develop, the collective wisdom encoded in traditions. And yes, even through the superstitions that force us to pause, reflect, and recognize that we don't have all the answers. The most powerful people in history knew they didn't have all the answers. That's why they looked to the stars, the birds, the omens. They were humble enough to admit uncertainty. Maybe we should be too. So that's the story of royal superstitions. Not a story of foolishness, but a story of fear and hope. Not a story of ignorance, but a story of the eternal human struggle to make meaning in a universe that doesn't come with an instruction manual. These kings and queens and emperors, they were just like us, trying to do their best, making mistakes, looking for guidance, hoping that someone, somewhere, knew what they were doing, even when they themselves didn't. And in the end, maybe the greatest superstition of all is the belief that we're different from them, that we've outgrown the need for mystery, for ritual, for signs and wonders, that we've evolved beyond our ancestors' need to find meaning in the patterns of existence. We haven't. We've just changed the language we use to talk about it. And maybe that's okay. Maybe embracing a little mystery, a little superstition, a little willingness to believe that life is more than just random chaos. Maybe that's not weakness. Maybe that's what makes us beautifully, achingly, impossibly human. The ravens still guard the tower. The stars still wheel overhead. The patterns still emerge in the chaos. And we still look for signs, still knock on wood, still whisper our hopes to the universe. Because deep down, we know what those ancient rulers knew, that we're small and uncertain and afraid, that the future is unknowable, that the weight of decisions can crush us. And sometimes, just sometimes, it helps to believe that we're not alone in the darkness, that somewhere, somehow, the universe is paying attention, that the signs we see might actually mean something. Whether they do or not, whether it's all superstition or profound wisdom, perhaps doesn't matter as much as we think. What matters is that we're all in this together. All of us, ancient kings and modern citizens, emperors and ordinary people, all trying to navigate the beautiful, terrifying mystery of existence. All looking up at the stars and wondering, are you watching? Are you listening? Do you have a message for us? And in that wondering, In that eternal human question, there's something sacred. Something that connects us across millennia. Something that makes all our superstitions, the ancient ones and the modern ones, less about magic and more about hope. Hope that we matter, that our choices matter, that someone, somewhere, is guiding us through the darkness. And if that's superstition, then let us be superstitious. Because that hope, that connection, that refusal to believe we're alone in an uncaring universe, that's one of the most human things about us. It's what makes us reach for the stars, even when we don't fully understand them. What makes us look for patterns, even when they might just be coincidence. What makes us believe, even when belief seems foolish. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real magic. Not in the omens themselves, but in our endless, stubborn, beautiful capacity for wonder. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight, for listening to these stories, for thinking about these questions, for being willing to see our ancestors not as foolish, superstitious primitives, but as fellow travelers on this strange journey of consciousness in a mysterious universe. I hope you sleep well tonight. I hope your dreams are filled with wonder rather than worry. And I hope that when you face your own uncertain decisions, your own impossible choices, you remember that you're not alone. That every human who's ever lived has faced the same fear, the same doubt, the same desperate hope for guidance. And if you want to knock on wood, or cross your fingers, or say a little prayer to the universe, well, who's to say it doesn't help? Who's to say the ancient kings were wrong to consult their oracles and watch their birds and read their stars? They were doing what we all do, looking for light in the darkness, searching for meaning in the mystery, trying to believe that somehow, some way, everything will be all right. And perhaps that belief itself, that stubborn, irrational, beautiful human belief that we matter, that the universe cares, that there's meaning to be found, perhaps that's the most powerful magic of all. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May your omens be favorable. May your ravens stay loyal. May your stars shine bright. And may you always find comfort in the knowledge that you're part of a long, long line of humans who looked up at the night sky and dared to believe that someone was looking back. Good night. And until we meet again in another story, may wonder walk beside you, may mystery embrace you, and may you never lose the courage to believe in something larger than yourself. Rest well, traveler. The universe is vast, but you are not alone.